Chapter 164. Wei Wei's order to ram the ship meant that he was determined to cut off all means of retreat. Among the children of officials, there were very few people who were as decisive and fierce as him. Born in a prestigious family, they saw a lot and received a lot. Usually they were not generous, but they were more calculative. Wei Wei was only seeking fame, hoping to win a good reputation for himself. If he helped his father in his official career, it would be icing on the cake, so he would not really feel sorry for Su Fengnian. His father, Wei Longwang, was just a dragon king in a small temple in the Big River and Big Lake. He was far from Su Xiao, a dragon who could turn the world upside down. He heard that this big pillar of the country was staying in the capital at this time. If Su Fengnian met with misfortune, this kind of thunderous shock, second only to the anger of the emperor, Wei Wei knew how powerful it was. The king of Jing'an, on the other hand, wanted a 5-clawed python robe. The difference was like heaven and earth. Therefore, after some consideration, he was willing to take the risk out of desperation. If the attack failed, then so be it. On the Battle of Spring God Lake, who would pay attention to the hidden 10 steps 1 kill? Wei Wei stood by the window, expecting the yellow dragon to ram the enemy's ship. Instead, he saw an inconspicuous old man wearing a sheepskin coat leaping out of the deck. He saw the old man's toes lightly touch the hull of the yellow dragon, and the big yellow dragon, which could run amok on Spring God Lake, capsized? It really capsized. Wei Wei was dumbstruck. His hands tightly gripped the windowsill. The dragon claw hand master reared in Jing and Palace turned back as soon as he left the cabin. He shook his head at His Royal Highness with a calm face. In an instant, the lake water surged violently, causing the yellow dragon ship to shake violently. Why? The king of Jing'an was relatively calm. A one-armed old man stepped on the yellow dragon ship and capsized it. The retainer, who was already 70 years old, smiled bitterly. One step. The crown prince clenched the wine cup with 2 fingers. One step. The master in Jing'an Palace, who was well-dressed and well-fed, nodded. His expression was extremely unnatural. He was also a lackey in the king's mansion. He knew that even if he was given 10 or 100 kicks, he would not be able to capsize a ship that could carry 500 tons of cargo. First-level master? The crown prince suddenly laughed. The retainer sighed helplessly. Not far off. The crown prince seemed to be much more relaxed. He was not discouraged by the one-armed man's feat. He asked curiously, "One-armed? Do you know of a one-armed master in Bailiang?" The squire shook his head. "I've never heard of him. He's probably a figure that Bailiang Palace secretly invited out of seclusion." Crown Prince King of Jing'an stood up and prepared to go to another cabin. Out of sight, out of mind. The general of the ship had already sent Huang Tu-Lang to save them. Even he had been stepped on by the old celestial. He could only hope that Granddad Deity wouldn't be so calculative with ants like them. "We all know how strong you are. Rest well and don't kick us a second time." Wei Wei knew that the situation was hopeless. It was over. His face was ashen. This evil flood dragon, who had never failed on the Spring God Lake, turned around and slumped back into his chair. Beside him was his best friend, whose face had been scratched by the halberd. He was crying bitterly. Wei Wei couldn't understand how 100 Bailiang soldiers could suppress 400 Huang Tu-Lang to the point that they didn't even dare to breathe. He also couldn't understand how someone could beat the yellow dragon with the strength of a leg. Was the main warship of the Qingzhou Navy just a small boat? Su Fengnian didn't expect the old god of swords to make such a move. However, since he had created such a scene, he used the momentum to jump onto the yellow dragon ship. The Huang Tu-Lang, who were busy trying to salvage the people who had fallen into the water, all ran away in fear. The old Taoist Wei Shuyang, the halberd Ning Amei, and Lu Yongshu all followed His Royal Highness and jumped onto the yellow dragon. They went up to the 3rd floor, which was originally used as a lookout. Coincidentally, they met Crown Prince King of Jing'an, who was about to leave in a hurry. Su Fengnian used the winter-embroidered scabbard to press against the Crown Prince's chest. The Crown Prince's personal guards tried to stop him, but they were instantly pointed at by Ning Amei's halberd and surrounded by Lu Yongshu and the other 2. The dragon claw hand expert who had been pampered in the Jing'an Palace didn't dare to move. Su Fengnian used a bit of strength on the winter-embroidered scabbard and pushed the Crown Prince, whose identity he had vaguely guessed, back into the cabin. The group of people inside, more than 10 of Qingzhou's most prominent young masters and daughters, all looked at the white-robed, white horse, and Bailiang Butcher's son. The Qingzhou socialites widened their eyes in surprise, amazement, fear, and worship. Just their expressions and gazes were a moving picture. The Green Party in the imperial court was powerful. Who outside the borders would dare to challenge the tightly knit Qingzhou children? Not to mention that the king of Jing'an and his royal highness were standing in the circle. Su Fengnian smiled and asked, "Kid, you want to slip away? This yellow dragon ship is only so big. Where can you hide from this crown prince?" On the surface, the king of Jing'an's crown prince appeared to be extremely cultured. Obviously, he had received the teachings of the king of Jing'an, Zhao Hang. Even with Su Fengnian's scabbard pressed against his chest, he still had a look of indifference on his face. Indifferently he said, "I'm going out to get some fresh air. While I'm at it, I'm going to experience His Royal Highness's elegant demeanor." Su Fengnian slightly retracted the winter-embroidered scabbard, but he didn't put it back on his waist. Instead, he raised it and lightly slapped the face of the guy in front of him. This action was extremely humiliating. Su Fengnian's mouth was even more mocking as he said, "Don't think that this crown prince doesn't know who you are. Surnamed Zhao, given name Sun, the eldest son of the king of Jing'an, Zhao Hang. How can there be such a big gap between you and my crown prince?" Zhao Sun, whose cheeks were red from the slap, looked straight at Su Fengnian and calmly said, "The king of Bailiang's martial arts are unparalleled for thousands of years. My royal father is wholeheartedly devoted to Buddhism. Naturally, we can't compare." Zhao Sun's words had a hidden meaning, but it wasn't too big. Everyone could tell that the king of Jing'an's crown prince was simply saying that Su Fengnian's current glory was all because of his father, who carried the world's infamy as a butcher. It had nothing to do with His Royal Highness. Pa! Su Fengnian's winter-embroidered scabbard was especially forceful this time. King of Jing'an's crown prince Zhao Sun seeped out a trace of blood from the corner of his mouth. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Well said, you deserve a reward. This crown prince will reward you handsomely with a winter-embroidered scabbard." Zhao Sun was still forcing a smile. Jing'an Palace's retainers were already prepared to risk their lives to save their crown prince, but Su Fengnian had already brushed past Zhao Sun and said softly, "I'll accept the Yellow Dragon cruise ship. I'll have to trouble you to jump off the ship and swim back to Xiangfan. Tell Zhao Hang that when the time comes, the father and son will go out of the city to welcome the crown prince." Zhao Sun didn't even bother to wipe the scarlet blood from the corner of his mouth. He walked straight out of the cabin and slowly said, "Xiangfan City will definitely welcome the crown prince." Su Fengnian didn't pay any attention to the king of Jing'an's crown prince, who was about to become a drowning dog. He first gave a warm smile to the group of dumbfounded young ladies, then turned his head to look at the capital's son, hedonist Zhao, who was cowering in the corner, as well as the fearful evil flood dragon Wei Wei. He pointed at the two with his winter-embroidered scabbard and smiled. "One of you is the son of a fourth-ranked official. You formed a clique and made Zhao Sun deliver himself to your doorstep. Good job. The other is the son of Qingzhou's Dragon King. He dares to pull the bow and shoot arrows, and dares to ram the Yellow Dragon cruise ship. He's even more of a hero." Zhang Enai, who had followed the old god of swords to the third floor of the cabin, had a strange expression on her face when she saw this scene. Could it be that Su Fengnian was so domineering and rude to outsiders? Previously, in Bailiang Palace, she only heard that he made a move on the maids in the residence. After leaving Bailiang, he tormented Jean Lanting in the county town. When he arrived in Qingzhou, he wantonly played with the Qingzhou Navy. She originally thought that he only knew how to bully weak women. Su Fengnian wasn't in a hurry to deal with Wei Wei and the one surnamed Zhao. He turned his head to look at the young ladies of Qingzhou and said with a bright smile, "Which elder sister or younger sister knows how to make tea? Let's drink tea and enjoy the scenery together. I hate fighting and killing very much. If I frighten elder sister or younger sister, later on, allow me to use tea in place of wine and punish myself by drinking 3 or 10 cups. How about this?" The second sister, an oval-faced young lady from Bailiang, wasn't the slightest bit afraid of the crown prince. She volunteered with a smile and said, "I brought some spring tea before the rain and a set of tea sets. I haven't had the time to make tea yet." Su Fengnian treated the women on the ship as if they were two different people. He was so easy to talk to that it was a complete mess. He laughed and said, "It's fate, it's fate." Jiang Ni's small face stiffened. Look, this guy's foxtail was suddenly revealed. Despicable. That gloomy guy with a swollen face was despicable just looking at him. But this guy who was flirting with the group of young ladies as soon as he boarded the ship was the most despicable. Chapter 165. Every time Su Fengnian took a step forward, Wei Wei and the one surnamed Zhao would take 2 steps back, until there was nowhere to retreat. Su Feng came to the window and happened to see the heir apparent of the king of Jing'an and his retinue jump into the water. Su Fengnian narrowed his eyes, feeling deeply moved. At that time, Zhao Hang, the 6th prince, had the greatest influence. The Empress Dowager regarded this filial son the most highly. The faction of relatives and the leaderless civil officials hit it off. And it was at that time that Zhao Hang wrote the poem, "Raise an army of 1,000,000 to drive away the Mang slaves, immediately erect a monument on the first peak." That time could be said to be the most glorious period of Prince Jing'an's life. Who would have thought that the mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind? The 2nd prince, who was originally the least favored, suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It was unknown how he obtained the full support of the eunuchs, chamberlains, and military generals. First, he secretly detained the Empress Dowager, then he launched a series of assassinations. Several powerful relatives died in one night. The posthumous edict appeared again. It was clearly written that the previous emperor wished for the 2nd prince to ascend the throne. The 2nd prince rightfully sat on the emperor's throne and became the current emperor. The 8 princes contended for the throne, causing a disaster. In the end, only one of the former crown prince died. In fact, in the eyes of those with discerning eyes, this could be considered as His Majesty the Emperor being merciful and lenient. It was much better than the deaths of all the princes and grandsons of the previous dynasties. Zhao Hang and the other princes were successively conferred the title of vassal kings, each having their own fiefdom and military power. Although the vassal laws was extremely harsh, Prince Jing'an, Prince Zhao Hang, Prince Huainan, Prince Zhao Ying, and the other weaker vassal kings did not utter a single word of complaint that reached the ears of the people under the heavens. Although the vassal laws was extremely harsh, Prince Jing'an, Prince Zhao Hang, Prince Huainan, Prince Zhao Ying, and the other weaker vassal kings did not complain at all. As for how the master and servant would go to Xiangfan, this was not Su Fengnian's concern. After thinking for a while, he turned to Ning Amei and said, "Kick the Huang Tu Lang who fell into the water again. One ship cannot carry so many people. Let the general of the ship take them to Mount Lao. Wang Linquan will be in charge of receiving them. When you kick their butts, don't forget to mention that there is good food and drink at Mount Lao. I have done my best." Ning Amei accepted the order and left. When the young ladies of the noble families of Qingzhou heard the words of the Bailiang heir, they could not help but laugh. They looked at each other and laughed. To them, the Bailiang heir and the Bailiang heir were people far away in the sky. No matter how much they struggled in the imperial court, they would not be implicated. The Green Party had never participated in direct battles with the vassal kings. The Green Party was known as the best in the imperial court. If not for this, why was the Green Party the only one in 30 provinces? The Bailiang heir in front of them was rather interesting. Even though on the surface he was slapping the face of the Qingzhou Navy, he was secretly targeting the Jing'an palace. As a result, the Green Party, who kept a clear distance from the king of Jing and Zhao Hang, felt much more at ease. They guessed that the ancestors would not be angry. It was true that the noble families of Qingzhou were united, but it was obvious that Wei Chong's family was going to be abandoned. Rather than being dragged into the water, it was better to drink tea and enjoy the scenery on the side. To be on the same boat as the Bailiang, His Royal Highness, and enjoy the scenery. How big of a gimmick would it be if word got out? Su Fengnian finally came back to his senses. He walked to the corner, picked up Zhao Hang, and threw him out of the window. He fell into the water with a howl. He then said to Wei Wei, who looked like he was going to trap the beast and fight to the death, "Let's use the ship and bring it outside of Xiangfan City, and we'll write off all our grievances. How about it?" Wei Wei, who had long given up all hope and was prepared to fight to the death, was first stunned. Then his pockmarked face was filled with joy. With a plop, he knelt down and prostrated himself on the ground. In a trembling voice he said, "Thank you, His Royal Highness." Su Fengnian used his foot to step on Wei Jiao's head and scolded jokingly, "You blind thing. I heard that you've been racking your brains to become sworn brothers with Li Hanlin. Don't you know who he's been taking the blame for all these years?" Although Wei Wei was kneeling and had his head stepped on, his heart felt more and more at ease. He raised his head and smiled flatteringly. It's all my fault for not recognizing Mount Tai. A man who knows when to yield and when to stand tall. This was true on and off the bed. Even if it was someone like Wei Wei who only knew how to be an unscrupulous hedonist, there were masters in all three professions. Most of them were able to do something of their own. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Get up. A man has gold under his knees. What's the matter with kneeling in front of me?" Wei Wei carefully stood up. Just as he let out a sigh of relief, the Bailiang heir's next sentence brought him back to his original state. "Your archery is not bad. It said that you practiced it by killing women. Go, shoot an arrow at the son of the governor. If you kill him, I'll introduce you to Li Hanlin. If you don't kill him..." Wei Wei was silent. Chapter 166. When Su Fengnian pretended to wipe the dust off Wei Wei's body, he said in a low voice, "Wang Linquan's silver is my silver. Wang Linquan's grandmother is my grandmother's mountain. Do you really think that Qingzhou belongs to the Green faction? On this trip to Xiangfan, there will naturally be people who will help you think of how to impeach this Xueqi, how to act arrogantly on the Spring God Lake and how to insult the king of Jing'an and beat up Xueqi Zhao Sun. However, when you go out to shoot arrows, remember to be clean. This Xueqi can guarantee that the sisters at the table will not gossip. How about it?" Wei Wei bowed and left the cabin with large strides. Su Fengnian sat in front of the table and sat shoulder to shoulder with the oval-faced beauty who was raising her snow-white wrist to brew tea. He sat with the other Qingzhou ladies who were sitting in pairs on long benches. Su Fengnian patiently waited for the spring god head to drink tea. He unscrupulously looked at the faces and figures of the wealthy ladies around him. Most of them were of average beauty. Only the tea maker beside him had a charm that was close to 81. Su Fengnian openly reached out and hugged her slender waist. Not only that, he stretched out his leg and lightly stepped on her lotus-root little feet. He turned his head to look at the blushing Qingzhou beauty and asked with a smile, "Dare I ask for elder sister's name? This Xueqi has a peach blossom beauty fan. When I return, I will draw elder sister's face on the fan and play with it every day." Play with it every day? The table of red and green orioles and swallows all looked at the oval-faced woman. Their eyes were mixed with mischief and jealousy. Although the woman who was hugged by Su Fengnian had a good upbringing and had always been bold in her actions and words, she still couldn't take it when she was openly teased like this. She didn't dare to dodge, nor did she want to dodge. She lowered her head and pretended to be paying attention to the situation. Her family background was not simple. Among the 4 pillars of the Liang dynasty, the Green faction was the smallest, but its voice was not weak. Among the 12 pillars of the dynasty and the Shang pillar, the Green faction had 4 seats. The ancestor of this woman's family was one of the Shang pillars. In the past 30 years, he had moved between the Ministry of War, Ministry of Revenue, and Ministry of Appointments. He had countless disciples and was known as the roly-poly of 2 dynasties. Someone once joked that the number of times this roly-poly personally witnessed was only slightly less than the old Grand Secretary. Su Fengnian finally drank the tea. He drank it as if it was wine. He smiled and said, "At night, if elder sisters and sisters feel that the blankets are not warm, just tell me and I will personally bring the thick brocade blankets." Naturally, there was another wave of bashfulness and coquettishness that could only be understood. The oval-faced beauty who was brewing tea quietly looked at Su Fengnian's side profile. She seemed to have noticed something and was in a daze. Su Fengnian turned his head and asked, "What's the matter?" She smiled gently and shook her head. After drinking the tea and winning a table full of laughter, Su Fengnian excused himself and left the cabin. He came to the bow of the ship. Yu Wei did not board the Yellow Dragon Fortress ship. Zhang Enai and the old god of swords stood to the side. Wei Wei had already shot dead the dandy surnamed Zhao, who was still holding Yan Huan's arm and calling her brother the day before. She sat on the deck at the stern of the ship, holding her big bow in a daze. Su Fengnian opened his mouth and asked with a smile, "Not seasick anymore?" Zhang Enai smiled coldly and said, "Isn't this tea delicious?" Su Fengnian pulled out a Bailiang arrow that was shot into the hull of the ship and held it in his hand. His body lazily leaned against the railing of the ship and looked at the vast lake. He said softly, "There's no taste. It's far from the spring god tea that I drank on Mount Lao." Zhang Enai asked expressionlessly, "Are we really going to Xiangfan?" Su Fengnian nodded. Zhang Enai frowned and said, "Are you not afraid that the king of Jing'an Zhao Hang will bring out thousands of men and horses to crush you into powder? Su Fengnian laughed involuntarily and said, "The king of Bailiang, his royal highness, died in Xiangfan. Zhao Heng cannot bear this crime. If he was really ruthless and not so indecisive, the world would be his." Zhao Heng, this vassal king's luck was not bad, but he always felt that everything he did would be in vain. He had ambition, otherwise he would not have said such a thing. If he wanted to benefit the world, his ability was not bad. When Xiangfan was destroyed, there were only 20,000 people left. After changing the flag on the city, these 20,000 people went crazy and wanted to crawl out of Xiangfan. The city became an empty city, a dead city. But under Zhao Heng's rule, he implemented Huang Lao's theory of non-interference. Today, the population of Xiangfan has recovered to a few 100,000 people. The title of being the most important city in the world is true to its name. King of Jing'an, this vassal king title was given very well. Zhao Heng's reputation among the people of Qingzhou is very good. He can be considered the best of the 7 vassal kings. This kind of person cherishes his reputation the most. What do I have to be afraid of? Maybe Zhao Heng will be worried that someone will frame him and will want to send troops to protect me. Little Mudman, do you believe me? Jiang and I said with a face of disbelief. Are you talking nonsense? The old god of swords smiled faintly. Little Su is not talking nonsense. Su Fengnian bent the Bailiang standard arrow with both hands and suddenly smiled. I heard that there are still 100,000 wandering ghosts in Xiangfan that are not willing to leave the city. Little Mudman, you have to be careful when the time comes. Jiang Ni's face turned snow white and he said with a strong front. The one who is afraid of retribution is you. What does it have to do with me? Back then, if the Pillar State hadn't been determined to besiege Xiangfan and refused to surrender, refusing to leave a life gate open, how could Xiangfan have become Fengdu? 10 years of being trapped in the city, the people in the city were sold like livestock. Kind mothers cut off their flesh to feed their children. Evil fathers threw their children into the cooking pot. The various states of the human world, good and evil, were all magnified in that ghost city. Every inch of wall was an inch of blood. Every inch of grass was an inch of sorrow. The Yin energy in Xiangfan was unimaginable. 10 years of attack and defense. Under the strict orders of the imperial court, no scholars or historians were allowed to write about it. How tragic was the truth. Chapter 167. Su Fengnian joked, that makes sense. When you enter Xiangfan, remember to stay away from me. Otherwise, why would I cut down so many peach trees in Jean Lanting's residence? It's all because Grandpa Wei is a master of the way of 9 bushels of rice, so he carries a few more peach wood swords to slay demons. You better get close to him these days. Otherwise, you'll be haunted by countless ghosts. Women have a Yin body, so their yang energy is far inferior to men's. Even old sword godly won't be able to save you. Jiang Ni's face turned even paler. She stammered, wanting to refute and encourage herself, but she didn't know what to say. The little clay figurine's appearance had always been ranked in the top 3 beauties Su Fengnian had ever seen in his life. The first was, of course, the androgynous white fox's face. The second was a woman he had seen by the Luoshui River during his 3 years of travel. Until now, he could not tell whether she was a woman from a landowning household or the god of the Luoshui River. However, she was beautiful. She was a woman in her 20s, but her face was still like a pattern in the 19 chess books. No matter how delicate it would not change much. However, the little clay figurine was different. She had been growing over the years. Her breasts, which were in line with the title of Princess Taiping in the past, were no longer Taiping. Instead, they were becoming more and more plump. Perhaps one day in the future, her face would quietly be comparable to white foxes. Su Fengnian liked to tease her, bully her, and plot against her. Part of the reason was that it had become a habit. The old god of swords couldn't bear to see Jiang and I being deceived and frightened by this little scoundrel Su Xiaobei. He unhappily said, "Girl, this little bastard is deliberately deceiving you. Ghosts are like immortals. If you believe it, then there is nothing. This old man has traveled Jianghu and seen all kinds of strange people. When it comes to immortals, only old Taoist Qi can count. If Xiangfan really has 100,000 ghosts who don't want to be reincarnated, how can hundreds of thousands of people survive these years?" Su Fengnian chuckled. He didn't mind Li Chuangong's sarcastic way of addressing him. He didn't care much about face. It wasn't something that His Highness was born with. It was something that he was forced to do. He continued to play with the arrow in his hand, whistling leisurely. What made the old god of swords feel defeated was that Su Xiaoshou's nonsense was obviously more lethal than his earnest and heartfelt advice. Little Zhang's beautiful little face was still pale, as if she was about to run to Wei Shuyong's side with the peachwood sword in his hand. She had not even reached Xiangfan yet. Zhang and I, who had a deep understanding of ghosts and gods, said fearfully, "Then I won't enter the city. I'll stay on the ship." Helpless, the elderly god of swords could only roll his eyes and sigh. He thought to himself, that little bastard is really little Zhang's nemesis. Su Fengnian laughed and said, "When we reach Xiangfan, we will have to abandon the ship and take the land route. What will you do then? Stay on the ship for the rest of your life? Let me tell you, there are countless water ghosts who died unjustly in the lake. Do you really think that the 10 years of war between Xiangfan and Xiangfan is just a simple siege? Only when the Xiangfan navy is wiped out would there be a siege. In the city, there's still the grand ritual of Zhou set up by the Taoist master of Mount Longhu. What's outside the city?" Zhang and I was speechless. She wanted to cry but had no tears. Old man Li couldn't bear to listen anymore. He rubbed his crotch and planned to walk around the yellow dragon ship. This pair of foes could do whatever they wanted, and he wasn't willing to get involved in their quarrel anymore. Zhang and I asked timidly, "The 36,500 grand ritual of Zhou set up by the Taoist master of Mount Longhu is very useful, right?" Su Fengnian glanced at Li Chuangong's back and said playfully, "Of course. The grand ritual of Zhou is the highest ritual in Taoism. Setting up 1,200 altars is already a grand scale. Generally speaking, it's only when something big happens in the emperor's family or the ancestral court of Taoism. The word ritual means the ceremony of pouring wine. To put it simply, it's the Taoist master inviting the celestial beings to drink wine. The grand ritual of Zhou before this dynasty was only set up for the prince with 2,400 celestial beings to pray for blessings and disasters. There's also the 3,600 grand ritual of Zhou for the emperor to protect the country and its people. Xiangfan was founded by the Taoist master's residence. The 36,500 grand ritual of Zhou was unprecedented in history. It's equivalent to inviting all the celestial beings in the heavens. Back then, the Taoist master's residence spent 900,000 taels of silver. If that wasn't enough, the Taoist master's residence would have moved out of Mount Longhu long ago. Zhang and I nodded heavily and clenched his fists. His face relaxed a lot. Unexpectedly, Su Fengnian changed the topic and laughed sinisterly. "But don't forget, just like you said, if the king of Jing'an wanted to deal with me, he would have needed 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers. It's obvious that the more powerful the enemy is, the more extravagant the situation will be. If the ghost city of Xiangfan didn't have any evil spirits that were hard to subdue, why would the dynasty spend so much money?" Zhang and I was scared silly again. Su Fengnian threw the bow and arrow to a Bailiang light cavalry downstairs who was collecting arrows. He walked towards Zhang and I and said in a low voice, "As for me, not only do I have Grandpa Wei's help, I also have many Taoist instruments on me. When we reach Xiangfan, you might as well sleep with me. It's best if we share the same bed, but even if we don't share the same bed, we have to share the same room." Chapter 168. Zhang and I kicked Su Fengnian's knee and angrily cried, "I'd rather be killed by the ghosts than live with you." Su Fengnian bent down and patted his expensive white satin robe. He gave her a thumbs up and smiled, "You have backbone." Su Fengnian pretended to remember something and smiled gently with ulterior motives. "Yes, I remember now. The 100,000 wandering souls of Xiang and Fan are mortal enemies with Su Xiao, which means that they are my mortal enemies. After you were killed by the wild ghosts, you must have something in common. The more they like you, the more you can't be reincarnated. You can talk about my bad day and night together for 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years." The little mudman stared at His Royal Highness, who was the most despicable, sinister and scoundrel. She choked with sobs and cried until her eyes turned red. Su Fengnian sighed quietly and restrained his expression. He reached out to wipe the tears on the little girl's cheeks. But before Zhang and I turned around, he retracted his hand and said softly, "Little fool, you really believe my nonsense. Think about it. You want to use the talisman to assassinate me. How can the ghosts be willing to kill you? They want you to live a long life to avenge them, right?" Zhang and I nodded blankly, sobbing as she nodded. Su Fengnian turned to look in the direction of Xiangfan. His hands were on his saber. A gentle breeze blew, brushing against his face and sleeves. The crown prince, who had a pair of red phoenix eyes and a red mark on his forehead, looked like an immortal. Su Fengnian whispered to himself, "So what are you afraid of?" "I should be afraid of Xiangfan. You know, I really believe in Buddhism, in the 6 realms of reincarnation, and in karma." Jiang Enai wiped the corner of her eyes and asked blankly, "Then why are you still going to Xiangfan?" Su Fengnian smiled, "I'm going to watch the fun. Don't you want to see the 36,500 Zhou Tian ritual?" Jiang Enai shook her head. "Not at all." Su Fengnian stretched. "Let's go. It's time for you to read." The books were all on the merchant ship. The two walked down the Yellow Dragon cruise ship one after the other. Su Fengnian said he would jump over her, but she refused. Su Fengnian could only stop the 2 ships and set up a wooden plank between the ships. Su Fengnian let Jiang Enai walk first. She walked carefully as if she was walking on thin ice. However, the more one was afraid, the more likely it was to happen. Halfway through, Jiang Enai swayed and almost fell into the spring Immortal lake. Fortunately, Su Fengnian held her shoulders with both hands. However, she was severely seasick and didn't know how to swim. After stabilizing her body, she didn't dare to move anymore. Su Fengnian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He could only pick up this strange girl who said she was timid but dared to assassinate him and said she was bold but didn't dare to take another step. Ignoring her struggles, he walked to the deck of the ship and put her down. As a result, he received a good beating from her. In the cabin, she was gnashing her teeth as she read. Su Fengnian was multitasking. He listened to Jiang Enai read while reading the geography of Qingzhou. On the table, there was a map of Xiangfan that Wang Linquan had specially collected. Just by looking at the drawing, one could tell that it was a majestic city. Over the next few days, the noble ladies of Qingzhou left in 3 groups. Most of them were unwilling to go to Xiang and Fan. Firstly, the ghost city's Qi was too heavy. Secondly, they didn't want to be seen by the Jing and palace that they were in the city with Bailiang and His Royal Highness. The oval-faced beauty was the last to leave. For the past few days, she had spent most of her time sipping tea and chatting with His Royal Highness. Her hands had been touched, her feet had been stepped on, her slender waist had been hugged, and her cheeks had been pinched. Fortunately, she was still a virgin. Whether it was fortunate or unfortunate, looking at her expression when she left, it seemed that the latter was more likely. The women of Qingzhou valued fame more than life and death. In the past few years, when they entered the palace for the selection of consorts, this was the prefecture that paid the most attention. If the heir of Bailiang could be hereditary, according to the law, there would be 1 Wang Fei and 2 secondary Wang Fei. Would she really become the Wang Fei of the king of Bailiang? Other than the empress, there were only a few Wang Fei in the world. At most, there would be the crown prince's consort, who could compare? Although Su Fengnian was idle all day long, whether it was teasing the noble ladies of Qingzhou, listening to Jiang Ni's reading, or daydreaming at the bow of the ship at night, he was actually racking his brains to figure out how to swallow the great yellow courtyard in his body. The great yellow courtyard had only absorbed about 20%. The embroidered winter sword in his hand could break the 6 armors. At dusk, they approached Xiang and Fan City. Su Fengnian walked to the deck of the Yellow Dragon ship and suppressed the irritation in his heart. For the past 2 days, he had been receiving news from Lu Qiu'er. It was neither good nor bad. One was that the crown prince, who had not been confirmed for a long time, was finally coming to the surface. Another was that the literary, martial and rouge reviews, which were held once every 10 years, had reappeared. Immortals and demons danced in Zhonghu. At the beginning of the martial arts review, it said that there were 3 sects in the world. In Buddhism, there was only Avalokitesvara. In Celestial Way, there was only Ancestor Lu. In Shen Wei, there was only Demon Rinsing Primogenitor. These 3 were the most mixed in the human world and were the closest to the people. Therefore, it was evaluated that the great Guanyin of the western regions had entered the 1st rank, little Ancestor Lu of Dragon Tiger Mountain had entered the 1st rank, and the new chief of Wudong had entered the 1st rank. In the martial arts evaluation, there was a separate sword evaluation. Wudong sword maniac Wang Xiaoping and sword crown Wu Lu Ding were listed. In the secret letter, Lu Qiu'er said that the great Guanyin had already left the western regions. Little Ancestor Lu's little celestial master Qi had also left the mountain. Obviously, most of them were coming for Su Fengnian. The capital was in turmoil. All kinds of immortals and demons came one after another. What would Su Fengnian, who was unintentionally standing at the head of the tide, do? Chapter 169. When they arrived at Xiangfan, they could see the famous Diaoyu platform on the city wall. The Diaoyu platform had supported the wall for 10 years and a half. On the signboard of the Diaoyu Tower, there were 4 words, "Alone fishing in the Central Plains." Su Fengnian ignored Wei Wei and Huang Tulang and got off the boat. He rode his horse and galloped towards the ghost city in the twilight. He got off the horse when he was near the city gate. Zhang and I seemed to think that His Royal Highness had a Taoist instrument. He jumped off the carriage and trotted to Su Fengnian's side. Su Fengnian held back his laughter and pointed his embroidered winter knife at the top of the city wall. He squinted his eyes and said, "Do you see that? Back then, the #1 general in the world guarded there for 10 years. There are not many people who can make Su Xiao grit his teeth. That scholar from West Chu who really read the spring and autumn annals can be ranked in the top 3. Even if your capital of West Chu is destroyed after the Western Wall, even if the whole of Zhongnan falls, this city and this Diaoyu platform will not fall. Unfortunately, no matter how impregnable Xiangfan is, it can't affect the world." Zhang and I bit his lips. Su Fengnian led the horse and walked slowly. The grain in the city eats the horses. When the horses are exhausted, the sparrows and rats eat the people. Zhang and I was silent. Su Fengnian said softly, "The soldiers knew they would die. The soldiers guarding the city fought to the last man. No one survived. This is the war of the spring and autumn annals. These tragedies are unimaginable to the sharp-tongued people of Shangyin Academy." The walls were made of huge bricks that were specially made in the 3 continents. Each brick had the name of the place where it was made, the supervisor, and the person who made the bricks. When the bricks were laid, the slurry of glutinous rice juice and sorghum juice, as well as lime and tung oil, was poured into the gaps between the bricks. The master craftsman in charge of the construction of the Xiang and Fan cities held a sharp awl. If the awl penetrated even an inch, he would kill the person who built the city and continue the construction. Therefore, the city was as solid as iron. At that time, the historians all called it cruel and cruel. Su Fengnian stopped and did not look at Jiang Ni's face. He said coldly, "When Su Xiao attacked the city, Wang Mingyang defended the city. Both sides prepared for war. This scholar, who used to be a scholar in Jixia, strengthened the defense and moved all the food and materials into the city. Even the houses were demolished and the wood, bricks, and tiles were moved into the city. To prevent Su Xiao from digging a tunnel, he dug 100 wells along the foot of the city and placed large earthen jars covered with leather in the wells so that those with good ears could listen. Not to mention the 50,000 soldiers. He also divided the 150,000 people into different classes. Monks, craftsmen, and paladins each had their own duties. The necessary materials for defending the city were divided into 2 categories: official and civilian. Then, he selected Zhonghu people who were good at fighting to patrol the city day and night to prevent spies from setting the city on fire. Wang Mingyang's military skills in the Shangyin Academy had been fully displayed in the past 10 years. Su Xiao once said that if everyone in Shangyin Academy was like this, he could even become a scholar in Jixia. Su Fengnian continued forward. To attack the city, one must first cross the river and cross the trench. Next is the most tragic climbing of the city. Climbing of the city is also known as climbing of ants. Looking at the top of the city, you can imagine the scene of thousands of people climbing up the ladder against arrows, boulders, wood, and oil. It was during this battle that the monks in the city invented the demon-subduing pestle, and the ox-nosed Taoist created the cauldron golden liquid that would fester the moment it touched the skin. In the alley battle after climbing the city, Xiangfan gathered a large number of Zhonghu people and heroes who swore to defend this important city for the 3 countries of the Central Plains. It could be said that they were united against a common enemy. Before the alley battle, they had defeated the Bailiang army countless times. If it were not for them, Xiangfan would not have needed 10 years to break the city. 3 years would have been enough. People only knew that Bailiang's army was the best in the world, but they did not know that they were not bad at attacking the city on foot. In the Spring and Autumn War, they were unstoppable. Only in Xiangfan did they lose more than half of their elites, including 300 cave masters who were good at drilling. This attack and defense took 10 years. As for who was right and who was wrong, only heaven knows. However, it was in these 10 years that Su Xiao, who would seek revenge for the smallest grievance, had a real feud with Zhonghu. The moat was unusually wide. The drawbridge on the river was not closed. Xianxia was strictly guarded at night, but the drawbridge had been laid flat all these years. Even the main gate had not been closed for a single night. It seemed that according to the instructions of the celestial master of Mount Longhu, after setting up more than 30,000 great cycle ritual to expiate the sins of the 9 underworlds, the ghost gate was not closed and the wronged souls were allowed to leave Fengdu and Xiangfan. Legend has it that before the celestial master of Mount Longhu left the city, he personally went around the city to draw talismans. In the end, he even hung a Taoist talisman on the top floor of the Diaoyu Terrace. On it was written, "The heavenly spirits have returned to the heavenly spirits. The earthly spirits should return to the earth." He said that when the wandering souls of Xiangfan dissipated, this talisman would burn up. However, the heavenly talisman had been written for many years and still did not disappear. Without a doubt, it became a haze that could not be removed from the hearts of hundreds of thousands of people in Xiangfan. Su Fengnian led the horse forward. Under his feet were 2 young Kuei. Beside him was Zhang Ni, who had a complicated expression. Su Fengnian subconsciously looked at the Diaoyu Terrace on top of the city wall. The moon was bright and the stars were sparse. The tower was magnificent. Su Fengnian turned his head to the little mudman and said gently, "Don't be afraid." Zhang Ni, whose palms were sweaty, lowered his head and grunted. His Royal Highness could not see the person in the tower when he raised his head, but the person in the tower could see Su Fengnian when he lowered his head. The person in the tower had a slender figure. He wore an ordinary Taoist robe and hemp shoes. He wore a Taoist bun with a wooden hairpin and held a horsetail whisk in his hand. The top floor of the Diaoyu Terrace was a forbidden area. There were several respected old Taoists of Mount Longhu guarding it. Even the king of Jing was not allowed to enter. When the great celestial master left the city, he made it clear that only the Taoist master's mansion could set foot on it. If the little girl and the little monk went to the Taoist master's mansion to make trouble, they would recognize this Taoist master. He was the one who led them into the inner courtyard of the Taoist master's mansion. It was he who blocked the attack of the arrogant yellow-purple Taoist master's mansion with his white-tailed horsetail whisk. He also personally introduced him to Mr. White Lotus. This little celestial master of Mount Longhu was surnamed Qi. He had the same surname as the great immortal Qi Xuanzhen, and the same appearance as one of the ancestors of Mount Longhu. He held a horsetail whisk in his hand and was praised by the national master who ruled the world as Tai Gong sits in Kunlun. After he left Mount Longhu, all kinds of rumors snowballed as if the whole world was praising him. However, he was indifferent because he didn't care about these things. To him, these great principles that most people couldn't understand were not principles. In the world, brothers were blind, children were filial, and husband and wife were in love. These were the principles. The great knowledge was just knowledge in the pile of books and classics. They were not knowledge. The old farmers worked hard to farm, the hawkers bargained, and the merchants pursued profits day and night. These were knowledge. He admitted that his Taoist roots were shallow, so he did not seek the way of heaven. He only wanted to enter the world through martial arts and help the world. He left the mountain for 2 things. The first was to enter Xiangfan. Before his master went into seclusion, he said that the heavenly talisman would burn. He wanted to confirm it with his own eyes. The second was to make a trip to Wudong to confirm whether the young chief could really shoulder the way of heaven. As for how to judge, it was very simple. The horsetail whisk in his hand could be used as a sword. If it could be killed, it was fake. If it could not be killed, it was real. He turned to look at the heavenly talisman that connected the world with a red rope and frowned. The heavenly talisman was shaking. Su Fengnian narrowed his eyes and saw a strange woman walking out of the city gate. She had 33,000 strands of worry on her head. She wore a snow-white monk robe and a white snake was biting on her wrist as a rope. She was barefoot, but her jade-like feet did not cause a speck of dust. She walked lightly on the suspension bridge. Outside the city gate of Xiangfan, the ghost Qi was as heavy as snow and covered the sky and earth. She was the only one who looked like a bodhisattva, transcending all living beings. On the fishing platform, the heavenly talisman burned to ashes. 10,000 ghosts out of the city. The Taoist from the Taoist master's residence side. Mount Longhu has lost. Mount Lontua has won. Chapter 170. The woman's skin was whiter than snow. When such a celestial woman walked out of the ghost gate of Xiangfan, Su Fengnian's horse lowered its head and neighed, its hooves pounding on the ground. Not only this animal, but the entire group of horses were doing the same. The young Kuei's scales stood up under Su Fengnian's feet. Its whole body was scarlet and its face was ferocious, as if it had encountered something dirty. Su Fengnian opened his eyes and looked over. He didn't know if the woman was a celestial or a mortal walking on the suspension bridge. There was no one stepping on the moat, but in an instant, the water was turbulent and boiling, as if thousands of soldiers and horses were passing by. The old god of swords, Li Chungang, showed a serious expression for the first time after leaving Liangzhou. With light steps, he swept in front of Su Fengnian and Jiang and I, standing at the end of the suspension bridge and facing the woman from afar. The white-clothed Guanyin continued to walk forward until she reached the middle of the suspension bridge. The old god of swords stretched out his only arm and took off the dagger talisman. The two of them faced each other. No one saw her move on the suspension bridge, but the moat suddenly exploded. The mirror image of what everyone saw was distorted, and only the white-clothed Guanyin remained clear and independent. Su Fengnian finally saw the woman's beautiful face that seemed to be shrouded by thousands of snowy mountains. He was stunned. The woman was as beautiful as a painting, and he knew who she was. Monk Long Shou, who claimed to be from Mount Lantua, said that he wanted to bring him to the western region. This monk in red robes and cassock was very otherworldly, so Su Fengnian specially went to the Tide Listening Pavilion to read the secret scriptures. The woman in front of him was the top Buddhist figure list, the master of the Red sect of Tantric Buddhism. She had a long list of titles, such as Great Compassion Dharma King, Bodhisattva Mending Acupoint, Master of 6 Jewels. She was an old woman in her 40s. Su Fengnian thought that she was already old, and even if she had the skill to retain her youth, she would not be that pure and youthful. However, the woman in front of him was a little too tall, and her face was no different from a woman in her 20s. Her eyes were compassionate, and she was born with a red mole in the middle of her forehead. Su Fengnian thought that if he had known that the master of Mount Lantua was so beautiful, he would have bargained with her. Dual cultivation? No problem. As long as the master was willing to leave the western region, Liangzhou's environment. His Royal Highness had mountains of gold and silver mountains. Would he lack of a bed? Su Fengnian calmed himself down and stood side by side with Li Chungang. He said softly, "This person is the Dharma King of Mount Lantua, also known as the Bodhisattva of 6 Pearls. It is said that she has Avalokitesvara Guru, Lotus King Guru, and Rathvajra Guru. Can you defeat her?" The old god of swords held the divine talisman with one arm and was all smiles. If he didn't know the identity of the old man in the sheepskin coat, he would have mistaken him for an old fellow who didn't respect himself and was blocking his way to take advantage of his beauty. Li Chungang lowered his head and spat out a mouthful of green gang qi that Su Fengnian could see with the naked eye. It wrapped around the priceless divine talisman and shone brilliantly in the night. The old man said softly, "The monks of Mount Lantua are known to be unkillable. Back then, the red-armored man fought with an old man with a pestle for 3 days and 3 nights. Neither of them could kill the other. The Vajra state of the First Order came from the Buddhism sect. This old man would like to see if he really has the Vajra body. However, it's unfair to fight with a little girl of the younger generation." Su Fengnian, who wished for the world to be in chaos, said, "The old god of swords is only holding a dagger. He's already conserving his strength and not bullying the younger generation." The cross-eyed old man glanced at His Highness the Crown Prince, who didn't want to settle the matter peacefully and only wanted to watch the battle from the sidelines. The corners of his mouth twitched, but he didn't mind. The reason why people couldn't make a name for themselves in swordsmanship was because they couldn't break 10,000 techniques with one sword. When fighting with others, they were afraid of this and that. They were so afraid that they would lose their swordsmanship in the end. Li Chungang was not willing to pay attention to Su Fengnian's narrow-mindedness. From Bailiang to Qingzhou and then to Xiangfan, he had been observing this Bailiang heir. The conclusion he came to was that this kid's talent in martial arts was not bad. He was determined to be ruthless. It was a pity that he started martial arts too late. Otherwise, he might have become a Chao Guanzi before he turned 30. The white-clothed Guanyin took another step forward and Li Chungang was about to attack with a green dragon. But she was only 1 step away. She stopped on the drawbridge. She did not look at the old god of swords, who was a potential enemy, but at the slowly retreating Su Fengnian. She raised her hand. The old god of swords, whose name was Sword Gang, had a talisman in his hand like a green snake. His gang qi was like a green snake spitting out its tongue. A gust of green gas gushed out and his entire arm was surrounded by green gas. But this female Dharmaraja, who was born in the imperial family of central India and was born on Mount Lantua, only raised her hand to lift the pot, uncorked it, and drank a mouthful of wine. The wine was not familiar with the old god of swords Xianxia, so much so that the entire drawbridge was filled with its fragrance. The little white snake coiled around her white arm. It was an extremely strange scene. This six-jewel bodhisattva glanced at Su Fengnian. With just a glance, Su Fengnian's great yellow courtyard surged like a tidal wave and he spat out a mouthful of blood. The retainers behind him were shocked and were about to step forward to protect him when Su Fengnian stopped them with a wave of his hand. After spitting out a mouthful of blood, Su Fengnian's chest was not stuffy but clear. Second heaven and third heaven? If I take a few more glances, won't the great yellow courtyard be in my body? Sure enough, she looked again. Just as Su Fengnian was dumbfounded, the old god of swords frowned and shouted softly. A wisp of green gang qi appeared on the drawbridge and seemed to sever the formless qi. He glared at Su Fengnian and said, "Brat, you don't know what's good for you. Do you really think she's a compassionate bodhisattva just because you gave her some benefits? Be careful, you won't even know how you died." The white-clothed Guanyin shook her head slightly, put away the wine pot, and walked forward silently. "Brat, you and Jiang last retreat." With that, the old god of swords stomped his foot. With the sole of his foot as the epicenter, a deafening ripple of dust appeared. Su Fengnian pulled Jiang and floated backward. The spotless female Dharmaraja ignored the formless sword qi from the old god of swords and walked forward barefoot. Just as the sword qi was about to reach him, a big monk in a red kasaya appeared between the old god of swords and the white-clothed Guanyin on the bridge. He had a wooden expression and managed to block the rings of sword qi. His kasaya fluttered in the wind as he stood tall. Su Fengnian sighed quietly. This monk, Long Shou, who had said that he would wait for 31 years, had appeared. If it was just a six-jewel Dharmaraja, Su Fengnian believed that with Li Chuangong's strength and the second-rank retainers behind him, it would not be impossible for them to trap this Guanyin of Mount Lantua, let alone kill her. Although the red-clothed monk was not a first-rank Dharmaraja, in this delicate situation, he was the biggest variable. Moreover, Su Fengnian did not have any ill feelings towards the monk in front of him. He had always respected eminent monks who had achieved the Tao. If they really fought to the death, regardless of the outcome, it would not be a pleasant thing to watch. The red-clothed monk put his palms together and bowed his head. "My master has entered the world without any intention of fighting. I hope that His Royal Highness will not blame him. My master has come out of Xiangfan to release 100,000 evil spirits from purgatory. He has accumulated immeasurable merit for His Royal Highness." Su Fengnian felt that these words were preposterous, but he believed them without a doubt. Both Buddhism and Taoism had recorded that there were 100,000 evil spirits in Xiangfan who had been cooked by their relatives. Their resentment was so great that even the 36,500 grand ritual of the cycle could not eliminate them. Thus, the two sects made an unwritten bet that whoever won would enter Xiangfan and whoever lost would leave Xiangfan. This would not change for 100 years. If Mount Longhu won, the two Zen temples and the monks of Mount Lantua would not be able to set foot in Xiangfan for 100 years. If they lost, Mount Longhu would have to withdraw the grand ritual of the cycle and move out of their Taoist temples. They would not be able to preach in the city. The disputes between the three sects and the sects for fame and fortune were actually childish and unreasonable. Jiang muttered, "She's so beautiful. She looks like Goddess Guanyin." Su Fengnian smiled bitterly. Goddess Guanyin observes the sounds of all living beings in the world. Ordinary people can be liberated by listening to her sounds. The goddess Guanyin in the eyes of the little clay figurine first brushed past Li Chungang at the bridgehead. She then brushed past His Royal Highness and said softly in Sanskrit, "I'm Guanyin. You're uncomfortable. You're not worthy of dual cultivation." Su Fengnian did not know why, but he laughed and said, "Since I'm uncomfortable, may I ask Bodhisattva to be at ease?" ###tomorrow update as the title. Recommended a few books and cartoons. Crossing the south and returning to the north, 13 lectures on ancient poetry. The unnatural death of China's literati, the Queen of Arms, was a female protagonist. The world of acceleration was a pig's horn. Chapter 171. After Su Fengnian finished speaking, he noticed that Guanyin Bodhisattva beside him was a head taller than him. She was walking barefoot. Su Fengnian's height was already outstanding. Most of the men in the cold lands were tall and sturdy, But Su Fengnian did not appear short at all. Coming to Jiangnan, he appeared even more slender. Among the women beside him, Jiang An'ai was still growing. Tall women like Yu Yuwei and Xu Xiu were half a head shorter than him. But the female Dharmaraja was even taller than His Royal Highness. Not to mention how unconventional her clothing and temperament were. Just her height alone was rather eye-catching. After the two brushed past each other, Su Fengnian very ungracefully turned his head to stare at the Dharmaraja of Mount Lantua. The wooden-faced monk Long Shou once again put his palms together, greeting His Royal Highness alone. The two had met twice in Beiliang. In addition, although Su Fengnian had a bad reputation, he was close to Su Fengnian. Everyone in Beiliang knew this, so the monk Long Shou did not dislike Su Fengnian. The red-clothed monk threw a peach at him, and Su Fengnian returned the favor by nodding his head slightly. Because of Wang Fei's worship of Buddhism, Su Fengnian loved the house and its crow. He was well versed in many Buddhist sections. This was not to belittle the principles of Taoism. He still agreed that the roots of the Central Plains were in Taoism. It was just that he had been exposed to the enmity between Su Shao and Taoism since he was young. It was inevitable that he would have some opinions about some Taoist figures. In fact, Buddhism had always been called the Western religion by the scholars of the Central Plains. It was a very derogatory term. After the War of the Spring and Autumn Kingdom, the remnants of the fallen countries that did not care about fame and fortune in the early days all hid from the world. Once they chose Buddhism, they were widely criticized by the people. They were called escape from Zen because of the fear of death, and cursed that the old monks' true colors were excellent. However, as the current emperor began to worship Buddhism, their views changed. There were no less than 10,000 wandering monks in the capital alone, but Buddhism did not have a leader. It was not as clear-cut as the Taoism of Mount Longhu. The black-clothed old monk Yang Tai Sui was the imperial tutor of 2 dynasties. He had enough skills and experience and was the best candidate to be the leader of Buddhism. Unfortunately, the sickly old monk was a rootless duckweed. He had even severed ties with his family early on. Even when he taught the sons and grandsons of the emperor, he would keep a straight face. It was rumored that he had broken a few feather dusters in the inner palace. The princes and princesses were all very afraid of this old monk. In the palace, Princess Xueqi was the most domineering. Even the fearless ones said that she was only afraid of black rice crust. In addition, the black-clothed old monk had been refusing visitors for more than a decade. If he did not form a faction and was alone, how could he have any power? The white-clothed Guanyin fluttered away, turning a deaf ear to Su Fengnian's shameless request for freedom. Once she left, monk Long Shou, who had been willing to wait for 30 years, no longer had any reason to draw a circle on the ground and follow her back to Mount Lantua. Other than the 2 Zen temples, the monks all wanted to say that they came from Mount Lantua, but none of them actually went to Mount Lantua. Su Fengnian caught a glimpse of Jiang An'ai, who was staring at the back of the female Dharmaraja with a blank expression. He could not help but tease. "You want to go to Mount Lantua with me? You want to be a concubine or a nun? Let me tell you in advance, eating vegetarian food and praying to Buddha is much more difficult than studying to earn money." Li Chungang, who had gently tucked the divine talisman back into his hairbun, said playfully, "This woman from Mount Lantua has the intention of practicing dual cultivation with you?" Su Fengnian said regretfully, "In the past, I was afraid that she would be an old cow eating young grass, so I refused her no matter what. Now, it's her turn to despise me. What a world." The old god of swords finally had a chance to make a dig at Su Fengnian, so he naturally would not miss it. He said sarcastically, "Young Su," she said in front of a large group of people, "that you are not worthy of practicing dual cultivation. You are the great king of Beiliang, and His Royal Highness. How can you tolerate that? Won't you be the laughing-stock of the world if this gets out?" Su Fengnian said, "It's best if they laugh to death. I don't even need to learn the sword anymore. If I see someone I don't like, I'll tell them this joke. They'll die of laughter after hearing it." Old Man Li was stunned. Jiang An'ai, who had finally regained his senses, heard such shameless words and said angrily, "You're really shameless." Su Fengnian said helplessly, "Then can you give me a way to save my face? Let 100 people rush up and beat up this goddess Guanyin? Or kneel on the ground and beg her to practice dual cultivation with me?" The little clay figurine was in a good mood after seeing Su Fengnian being looked down upon by the goddess in her heart. She turned around and repeated with a smile, "Not worthy, not worthy, not worthy." Su Fengnian purposely distanced himself from Jiang An'ai. He looked at the city wall and sighed. Tonight is a good day for 100,000 wild ghosts to come out of the city. Jiang and I immediately shut up and subconsciously walked closer to Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian took the lead and walked up the suspension bridge. Xiangfan was a typical majestic city in military books. The outer edge of the city was built with a protruding horse face. Su Fengnian walked past the moat and thought about the first attack and defense of the country war years ago. He could not help but remember the Trojan bull during the siege. He turned around and asked the old god of swords behind him, "What's the origin of the name Trojan bull?" Su Fengnian seemed to realize that this question was inappropriate after he asked it. To a swordsman, having his sword broken was undoubtedly the greatest humiliation in his life. Moreover, it was broken by two of Wang Xianji's fingers. He did not expect old man Li to be so nonchalant. He only nodded calmly and said, "The name Trojan bull indeed came from the siege weapon that you guessed. It means that all the enemies in the world are cities. There's no city that Trojan bull can't break. The forging of Trojan bull and the divine talisman are no different. They both came from a piece of flying rock. The previous emperor sent people overseas to visit immortals. They happened to encounter a flying rock that fell into the sea and caused 1,000 waves. They fished it up from the bottom of the sea. Half of it was used to forge the Trojan bull and the other half to create the red armor of the talisman general. The remaining essence was used to create the divine talisman dagger on this old man's head." Su Fengnian teased, "Then you and the little clay figurine are really fated." The old god of swords chuckled. Chapter 172. The city was strictly guarded at night, but that was only for normal people. For Su Fengnian, a top nobleman who dared to fight with the Qingzhou navy, as well as a deity from Mount Lantua, he could come and go as he pleased. The guards at the gate had most likely received instructions from the king of Jing and Zhao Hang, and did not stop him. Otherwise, if they met, it would just be giving face to Su Fengnian. They could not hope to make the crown prince of Beiliang suffer in such a small matter. Even now, no one could say that Su Fengnian would be punished for the farce at the Spring Deity Lake. After all, it was different from the past. Right now, the king of Beiliang, dressed in a blue satin robe with 9 dragons, was in the capital. For the first time in the morning court session in the Golden Imperial Palace, this king with a different surname carried a sword as he ascended the throne. Faced with the censure of several officials, other than Zhang Julu, Gu Jiantang, and the 3 grand secretaries of the palace, Ren Tu only stood there and dozed off, ignoring all of them. As for whether or not there was fear behind his anger, no one knew. There were rumors in the capital that the king of Beiliang and his cavalry were resting at the Xiamawi Inn, which was deserted. Everyone in the capital was delighted and applauded. They all said that this was the will of the heavens, and that the unjust will find little help. The fate of Beiliang had come to an end. The Xiamawi Inn was truly deserted. In the inner courtyard, the king of Beiliang, dressed in the garb of a rich man, was drinking green ant wine with an old monk in black. The wine was something that Su Xiao had specially brought from Liangzhou to Graydon City. The old man in front of him, nicknamed the Sickly Tiger, had been forcefully dragged over by Su Xiao. In fact, over the years, the green ant wine had been sold in the capital because of his second daughter, Su Weisheng's brother appreciating the snow. However, the king of Beiliang had personally brought the strong wine for thousands of li. The gift was light, but the affection was great. This could be considered a way for Su Xiao to express his attitude to an old friend in a foreign land. "You, Yang Taisui, did not treat me as a friend. Even when I entered the city, you had to keep an eye on me for the emperor. However, Su Xiao still treated you, old bald donkey, as a friend. That year, you treated me as a farewell." The spring chill in the capital had long been eliminated, and the chirping of cicadas did not stop. However, Su Xiao still seemed to be afraid of the cold. He raised his hand and exhaled. He sighed and said, "When I left the capital, I remembered that the dynasty had 1,864 post-house stations. Now that so many countries have been annexed, can there still be half left?" The black-robed old monk said calmly, Great Peace City, the world is at peace and stability. Why is there a need to recreate the scene of the past when there were so many posts and messages flying everywhere? Isn't that a good thing?" Everyone knew that Su Xiao had an inseparable feeling for the post house because the Liang dynasty did not attach much importance to the construction of the post house back then. After Su Xiao took control of the military power, he proposed 10 policies. Among them, the The post house and horse policy were developed to the greatest extent in his hands. There were also a few policies that had died midway before they could be popularized because of the end of the spring and autumn period. The elimination of the post house was just a miniature version. When the Liang dynasty was at its peak, it was like passing one relay station after another. The relay stations were like fish scales. Ride after ride, the relay horses were like shooting stars. Therefore, when the war of the country ended, almost all the emperors of the fallen countries were escorted to Great Peace City. During this time, when they saw a relay station 30 li away, they were all shocked by Su Zhao's methods. Many famous generals who only complained about the timing and location after losing the war were finally convinced. Because a small relay station involved many things such as the relay route, each of them was extremely troublesome. Just the planting and maintenance of the plants on both sides of the relay route alone cost the national treasury a lot of silver every year. At that time, the war was in full swing. Not to mention the incapable emperors, the wise emperors only focused on the training of armor. They wanted to spend money today so they could see results tomorrow. As an official, how could they be like Su Xiao and persuade the emperor to spend money on a 100-year plan? Su Xiao smiled. Of course it is a good thing in the short term. After 100 years, it will be hard to say if it will be a good thing. The old monk in black was a monk, but he also drank wine. He took a sip and said calmly, "You don't have to worry." Su Xiao laughed involuntarily. "I'm not a monk like you. If I don't worry, how can I face the heroes who fought with me in the past? Who won this world?" Yang Taisui frowned and said, "Zhang Julu will worry. Gu Jiantang will also worry. Also, so what if you helped the late emperor win the world? Without you, lame Su, there would be lame Li and lame Wang. You were proud of your achievements, but the late emperor didn't get rid of the hound after the rabbit was killed. He still allowed you to be the king of Bailiang. Isn't that enough?" Su Xiao said softly, "It's enough. That's why I didn't do anything after you pulled me to drink. The favor I owed you and him back then has been repaid." At this point, the old monk in black felt guilty and stopped talking. His expression was slightly lonely. When that woman first entered the world, the sword case only had 9 words carved on it. "This sword pacifies the injustices of the world." When the late emperor learned of this, he smiled and said that without this sister-in-law, there would be no Su Xiao, and there wouldn't be his great country. The dragon sparrow sword of Daliang was worthy of these 9 words. That extraordinary woman only carved the last 9 words before she died. Every time the old monk in black thought of it, he felt guilty because he was the most guilty person in the world. The old monk asked, "Then why did you still invite me to drink?" Su Xiao snorted and said, "If it weren't for my wife persuading me all those years after I came to Bailiang, saying that a bald donkey like me had difficulties, I wouldn't have bothered with you no matter how magnanimous I am." Yang Taisui smiled bitterly. Su Xiao drank a mouthful of wine and sneered, "In the next court assembly, if Gu Jiantang dares to instigate a bunch of bastards to use underhanded tricks, don't blame me for pulling out my blade and hacking him." Yang Taisui frowned and said, "Even if Gu Jiantang is empty-handed, you can't beat him. He's the #1 sword user in the world." Su Xiao asked in return, "If I hack him, he dares to retaliate. Back then, when I beheaded his direct descendant and hung him on the city wall, he dares to stop me? He didn't dare back then, and now that he's getting older and older, he dares even less." The old monk in black chuckled and said, "Seems like he doesn't dare." Su Xiao smiled and said, "Isn't that so? How was this the king of Bailiang wearing a 5-clawed python robe? He was clearly a scoundrel in the marketplace. No wonder he could raise such an unscrupulous son like Su Fengnian." Su Xiao smiled and asked, "If I really hack Gu Jiantang to death, what will you do this time?" Yang Taisui said calmly, "I've already repaid the loyalty and righteousness I owe back then. Since you can invite me to drink today, I can invite you to kill someone and leave the capital tomorrow." Su Xiao laughed and said, "You bald donkey, at least you still have some conscience." The old monk in black remained silent. No one in the world was more trustworthy than this sickly tiger. The pot of green ants was quickly emptied. The old monk said softly, "You've caused the princess to live uncomfortably in the past, and now you've implicated your children, especially that Su Fengnian. Don't you feel any guilt?" Su Xiao smiled calmly and said, "We're not a family. Once you enter a family, you won't eat a family meal. What's there to live uncomfortably? It's all fate." The old monk sighed. Su Xiao asked, Do you know about the 6 jewels guru of Mount Lantua? The old monk nodded and said, when this person first started cultivating, he didn't talk to the outside world, unlike the rest of the world. He achieved the great moksha state of motion and stillness early on. He's a great sage in Buddhism. He leaped into the 8 jewels realm at the same time as the new chief of Mount Wudong. They're both rare bodhisattvas of flesh. Su Xiao nodded and frowned. The old monk asked, I heard that this red sex Dharma king went to Xiangfan, aren't you worried? Su Xiao muttered. How can I not be worried? She's dual cultivating with Feng Nian. I'm worried, but not dual cultivating. I'm even more worried. Chapter 173. It had already been 10 days since the king of Bailiang, Su Xiao, had arrived in the capital. In these 10 days, Su Xiao had not paid a visit to anyone, nor had anyone come to the Damayai courier station to present their name. Logically speaking, as a king with a different surname, Su Xiao should not be restricted by the rules and regulations of the clan and vassal law. Of the tens of thousands of officials in the capital, it would be best for them to curry favor with those in power. Even on the day when the results were released, quite a few officials would use the pretense of being from the same hometown to get close to those new grand scholars. Why was it that when it came to Su Xiao's side, not a single one of them showed up? In truth, with just a bit of thought, it was clear. In the imperial court, Grand Secretary Zhang led the civil officials, Gu Jiantang led the military generals, and the Green faction formed their own faction and roped in a group of stragglers. The remaining elders of the 8 perished countries supported each other, so it could still be considered a clear division. However, as the second generation of remaining young masters gradually rose to prominence, the earlier hostility and antagonism began to fade, and they began to integrate into the earlier tripartite balance of power. Among the 8 old countries, there were splits. Western Shu was the closest to Qingzhou, so most of them were absorbed by the Green faction. Many scholars in Western Chu naturally had a favorable impression of the current Grand Secretary Zhang Julu, who hailed from the Great Yellow Sect. As for the valiant Dongyue and other barbarian lands, they preferred Great General Gu Jiantang. The latter also felt that this group of youngsters who could ride a saber and spear, as well as write poetry and literature, was more to his liking. As a result, the old Grand Secretary and the other pillars of the country of the older generation did not see eye to eye with Su Xiao. The new generation of popular officials, influenced by their ancestors and the Spring and Autumn War, would not take the initiative to side with the remote king of Bailiang. Most of them were divided between the 4 factions on the surface. Of course, if the pillar of Bailiang took the initiative to favor them, it was likely that no one would refuse this enormous honor. Hadn't the minor official of Yongzhou, Jean Lanting, relied on a letter of recommendation from the pillar of Bailiang to become an extremely noble member of the Great Yellow Sect? Su Xiao was not late for today's morning court session. When he stepped out of the carriage, he was already wearing a blue satin robe embroidered with dragons. In the past, it had always been Grand Secretary Zhang Julu who was the earliest to enter, and Great General Gu, who had always been the last to enter, and no one daring to overstep. Apart from this, as for who would be the second and third to enter the palace, it wasn't too particular. Generally speaking, it should be based on seniority and rank. However, as the struggle between the factions in the court grew increasingly intense, it became increasingly unruly. The Gu faction was mostly martial artists, and they looked down on the remnants of defeated and perished countries. They also didn't have much respect for the Green faction. The Zhang faction, which had the most influence, had always been gentle and respectful. If the 4 factions were to include the 2 variables of the foreign relatives and eunuchs, in general, it was truly a chaotic and endless entanglement. In today's court session, most of the officials learned that Great General Gu had gone to the Liao 2 days ago and was destined not to return in a short amount of time. This made many of the spectators who were looking forward to the 2 famous generals of the spring and autumn period fighting fiercely in Baohe Palace feel extremely disappointed. Perhaps because the group of tigers had no leader, the Gu faction, who were originally used to being unreasonable and fighting to enter the palace, was extremely low-key today, not in a rush to pass South Tianmen. They only eyed the old cripple in the blue satin robe covetously. The Gu faction didn't make a move. The Zhang faction, because Grand Secretary Zhang stood at the door with his hands in his sleeves, as if waiting for someone, also didn't enter the palace. Known as Zhang faction's trusted civil official and conscience, the newly promoted Wuying Palace scholar Wen Shouxin stood next to the Grand Secretary. His forehead was covered in sweat, because the Grand Secretary didn't enter the palace. In front of him, A hunchbacked old man was currently walking over. The embroidered robe. Su Xiao chuckled and asked, "Scholar One, why aren't you carrying a coffin to court today?" When Xueqi still had some courage and insight. With a heavy cold snort, he didn't pay any attention to the mockery and ridicule. Earlier he had his old servant carry a coffin to court to ask for death, impeaching the king of Bailiang, Su Xiao, for the 10 great capital crimes, begging the emperor to pay with his life, only asking for Su Xiao's death. It could be said to be a magnificent feat. Which of the officials and common people of the capital didn't raise a thumb? Originally, some of the colleagues within the Zhang faction who had been silently criticizing him for being promoted to Wuxia Palace Scholar also became completely silent, tacitly agreeing with Grand Secretary Zhang's arrangements. The Zhang faction's influence was the most profound and vast, so if they lost anyone, they wouldn't lack anyone. As a result, the internal strife was often the fiercest. Zhang Julu surprisingly didn't care too much about this type of internal strife. As long as it didn't touch his bottom line, he never interfered. During these years, only a few people were expelled from the Zhang faction, their fates all dismal. If they weren't banished to the border, then they would never be employed again. When Su Xiao saw that this Wuxia Palace scholar was pretending to be deaf and mute, he patted his shoulder, saying with an amiable laugh, "The imperial court needs loyal and righteous subjects like you. I heard that when Scholar One was a county official, his sleeves were clean and his hands were clean to the extreme, even starving 2 of his daughters to death. When I first heard this news in Bailiang, I was already bewildered. How could this type of official only be an 8th-rank minor official? This is our Grand Secretary Zhang's mistake. Who would have thought that in just a few years, after Scholar Wen's 2 daughters died, in the blink of an eye, he would become a Wuxia Palace scholar? What rank does he rank among the 3 halls and 3 pavilions? It seems like Scholar Wen should still have a few fewer daughters. If he had 2 more, wouldn't Grand Secretary Zhang have nothing to do with it? Forget about Wuxia Palace scholar. Even that Preservation Palace scholar would similarly be in Wen Darren's bag. However, it's hard to say if Grand Secretary Zhang doesn't have many teachers. Just the death of an old Grand Secretary, yet he already has his current glory, Wen Darren still can't compare. Doesn't this mean that you 2 Darren are both profiting from the dead? These words are nonsense. The 2 Darren are both magnanimous prime ministers. Please don't take it to heart. When Xueqi's face flushed completely red, he wanted to curse out, but he didn't dare, feeling extremely sullen. There were a lot of Zhang faction officials who pretended to be angry, but there weren't actually that many who were truly angry. To the side, Grand Secretary Zhang Julu was over 50 years old, but he didn't look old. This current number 1 person's appearance was especially praised by others, with a purple beard and blue eyes, extremely imposing. When he was young, he was nicknamed Blue Eyes. When he worked as an aide for the old Grand Secretary, he was greatly valued. However, the old Grand Secretary was patient, willing to spend 30 years to carve this piece of unpolished jade. He didn't pull up seedlings to help them grow, refusing several promotions in the bureaucracy on behalf of his beloved disciple, to the extent where he didn't even care about the opportunity to be sent out to become a border official. Meanwhile, Zhang Julu was even more patient, spending 30 years of his life in the imperial family, neither arrogant nor impetuous, always patiently watching the court's political affairs with the cold eye of a bystander, only watching and listening, the only thing he didn't say. As soon as he left the imperial family, he became a dragon. Within 2 years after his respected teacher's death, he continuously rose 11 levels, taking over the old Grand Secretary's empty position, so much so that his position of authority even surpassed the old Grand Secretary's. Zhang Julu was ridiculed by Su Xiao, but he didn't show the slightest bit of abnormality. With an expressionless face he said, "Yang Guasher once said that if you have Buddha in your heart, you will see everyone as Buddha. If you have feces in your heart, you will see everything as feces." It is said that De Zhugua was also present when Yang Guasher said this. I don't know if De Zhugua heard it in his ears or in his heart. Su Xiao laughed out loud and said, "Whatever Yang Taisui said, no matter what you all think, except for the good things he said about me, I'll just treat it as bullshit." Zhang Julu dismissed it with a light laugh. The main buildings behind the imperial city's south gate were the 3 outer court halls and the 9 inner court halls. Among the 3 halls, the Palace of Preserving Peace was the most expensive. The common people in the marketplace called it the Hall of Golden Imperial Audience. They thought that all court meetings were held there, but that wasn't the case. The Palace of Preserving Peace was usually used for all kinds of major ceremonies. His Majesty would usually hold court in the Tianqian Palace or the Hall of Cultivation Spirit. It was probably to show his respect to the king of Bailiang, Su Xiao, that the 2 morning court meetings were held in the Palace of Preserving Peace. The roof of the Palace of Preserving Peace had a total of 18,000 dragon patterns. The roof of the Palace of Preserving Peace, the roof of the Palace of Preserving Peace, the roof of the Palace of Preserving Peace, the roof of the Palace of Preserving Peace. This was only the scale of the Palace of Preserving Peace. Spread out, the number of dragon patterns in the imperial city was innumerable. The huge platform of the Palace of Preserving Peace had the character Earth, facing the south. Starting from the south of the imperial city, the central axis of the Palace of Preserving Peace, the 3 halls were lined up in a row. Not a single tree was planted. To meet the Son of Heaven, the imperial road was long. The eunuchs and imperial bodyguards were hidden in the shadows of the strictly guarded buildings on both sides of the road. It was as if they were the only ones walking in the world. Therefore, when the blood-soaked Su Xiao met the emperor for the first time, he was counting the number of steps to dispel his fear. If Su Xiao was like this, it was needless to say that the other courtiers who attended court for the first time were trembling with fear. Accompanying the monarch was like accompanying a tiger. Especially since the 2 successive emperors of the dynasty were both heroes and great strategists. The monarch's scheming had reached the peak of perfection. No one dared to say that they were familiar with figuring out the emperor's will. This made the courtiers feel as if they were walking on thin ice. Today, the blue-eyed Zhang Julu intended to let Su Xiao be the first to attend court. Su Xiao also did not decline his responsibility, and took the lead to walk through the towering palace gate. It seemed that other than Zhang Julu, everyone had forgotten that as long as the Palace of Preserving Peace's Grand Secretary was empty, the civil officials had to respect the Great Pillar State as their leader. Chapter 174. Ever since Wudong's old chief, Wang Zhonglo, passed away, the incense that was already not much had decreased by a bit. Fortunately, the close to 1,000 old Taoists, middle-aged chancellor, and Taoist children behind the memorial arch were used to living a poor life. When the house leaks, it will be repaired. When the clothes are old, it will be repaired. When the clothes are old, it will be repaired. When the house leaks, it will be repaired. When the clothes are old, it will be repaired. When the house leaks, it will be repaired. When the house leaks, it will be repaired. When the clothes are old, it will be repaired. At this time, a young Taoist was squatting behind the memorial arch of black tortoise Dongxing and sighing. Beside him were a few mischievous Taoist children from the nearby Taoist temple. Each and every one of them were fighting over this Taoist priest to tell them some love stories from the book. This story was much more interesting than the Taoist scriptures, but it was a bit too desolate. Why didn't the men and women in the story have a good ending? Listening to the storyteller beside him nearing the end of the story, he became more and more worried. Didn't they force themselves to be beaten by their master with a plank to escape from the Taoist lesson and sneak out? Grand Marshal Granduncle, why are there so many riddles, drinking games and poems in this book? Don't tell me they were all thought up by one person. If it's true, how much knowledge does the person who wrote this book have? Isn't he almost comparable to Grand Marshal Granduncle? A little Taoist child who had only been on Wudong Mountain for less than 2 years asked timidly. The little Taoist child was born with red lips and white teeth. He was full of vigor. Propping his cheeks with both hands, he stared at his master's martial uncle. According to reason, he should be calling him Chief. However, it seemed that everyone in the book did not like this Grand Marshal Granduncle, so he still called him Chief, according to seniority. Nonsense! How can the person who wrote this book be more knowledgeable than Grand Marshal Granduncle? A little Taoist child who had entered the mountain a little earlier slapped the little Taoist child with a stern expression. The little Taoist child who was scolded held his head and did not dare to refute. I'm not talking nonsense. If the person who wrote this book and I were to debate about Taoist principles, I reckon he would not be able to win. However, when it comes to love and affection, I am 108,000 li away. This is the principle of specialization. In the future, when you study scriptures with your masters and encounter problems, don't think that your masters are always right. If I still say that you are wrong and you are still unconvinced, you can go down the mountain to find out who is right and who is wrong. If one day you feel that you have found the answer and that I and my masters were wrong, you can return to the mountain and tell us that we were really wrong. If you feel that you were wrong, don't feel ashamed. Remember that our Wudong Mountain gate will never be closed. The young Taoist smiled and rubbed the head of the youngest Taoist. His smile was warm. Grand Marshal Granduncle, I think it's wrong for Master to hit us whenever he's unhappy. What do you think? The little Taoist asked innocently. The young Taoist laughed softly and said, When I was young, I was also hit a few times. However, now I know that most of the time it was my own fault. After a while, I no longer care about it. Master and senior brothers are not saints without temper. It's inevitable that they will make some mistakes. In Wudong's 1,000 years of history, there are hundreds of thousands of recorded Taoists. However, there is only one statue of Xuanwu Tianzuan. We, including me, are all ordinary people. We have to allow others to make mistakes and allow ourselves to make mistakes. Don't be stubborn. Otherwise we will not be happy. It's not easy for us to come to the world. If we are always angry, even if you are a high and mighty emperor, it will be boring. Moreover, we are born in the world. Glory, splendor, wealth and status are nothing more than passing clouds. The Tao is made of gold and the medicinal pill furnace is filled with spring. Wudong is my pillow and my pillow is Wudong. That is enough. A slightly older Taoist whispered, Marshal Granduncle, I heard that rich people eat meat every day. I am so greedy. When I am hungry and recite scriptures, I always drool when I think about it. The most handsome young Taoist with the highest seniority smiled and said, Isn't eating meat every day the same as eating plain tea every day? Ching Feng, Marshal Granduncle gave you 10 steamed buns. You were the first to taste it. How does the 10th steamed bun taste? The young Taoist named Ching Feng said with a bitter face, 10 steamed buns. I am stuffed to death. The young Marshal Granduncle laughed and said, That's right. It is the same principle on the mountain. Senior brother sect leader said that it is better to have a high heart than a high Tao. If we are greedy, there will be no end. Before ancestor Lu ascended to immortality, he hung a sword on Nangong Yuejiao's head. Do you know what is the most powerful part of that sword? I heard from Master that the sword can fly for 1,000 miles. It must be to slay demons and eliminate devils. The young Marshal Granduncle listened with a smile and did not say anything. When it was quiet, he said softly, Ancestor Lu seemed to have left behind the 3-foot sword, but in reality, he left behind the Tao root and Wudong. He taught us to use the Ching Feng sword to cut away worries, greed, anger, and lust. Lust. The youngest Taoist child was confused. The rest of the young Taoist priests who didn't know much were all chuckling. The book I read is called The First Snow in the East Wing. It skipped some things about men and women. The young Marshal Granduncle said with a smile. Does Grand Marshal Granduncle have lust? The little guy asked. Without waiting for the Marshal Granduncle to reply, the little guy was beaten up by the senior brothers and junior uncles. The young Marshal Granduncle rubbed his little head again and said softly, Yes. There was a burst of surprised gasps, but no one thought that the self-proclaimed Wudong Mountain's young ancestor who claimed to have lust was not lofty, learned or amiable. The young Marshal Granduncle laughed and said, It is not a bad thing to know that you are not good. This is the same as us Taoists seeking the Tao of heaven. You know that it is not in my hands, so you want to seek the Tao. Marshal Granduncle, you still haven't sought the Tao? A young Taoist asked nervously. It is hard to say. The young Marshal Granduncle said honestly. At this time, a group of old pilgrims from Yongzhou finally walked more than 10 li of the divine path. Panting for breath, they arrived under the memorial arch. The young Taoist immediately stood up and called the young Taoist beside him to help carry the luggage. When they went up the mountain, the Taoist children skillfully introduced the scenery of Mount Wudong and the Taoist temple. The old pilgrims probably thought that the young Taoist children were amiable and cute, so they all showed a smile of vicissitudes. They walked and stopped, and their tiredness gradually disappeared. The young Marshal Granduncle knew that the younger generation would not be able to accompany them to the top of the mountain, so he let them go down the mountain first and picked up all the luggage alone. The old people felt apologetic, so the young Taoist, who did not speak much along the way, smiled and said it was nothing. The old pilgrims saw that he went up the mountain like moving clouds and flowing water, with an indescribable magical style. It really did not seem like he was pretending to be relaxed, so they felt a lot more relieved. Without the young Taoist children, the old pilgrims finally asked a slightly sensitive question, which could not be avoided from the old and new Wudong Mountain. The last time this group of old pilgrims from Yongzhou came to Wudong was more than 10 years ago. This time, it was almost the last time in their lives that they would climb the mountain to burn incense. Most of them did not have a bad impression of Wudong, but their families' descendants were more willing to go to Mount Longhu. Their bodies could not walk, but their words revealed that if they were 20 years younger, perhaps they would really go to Mount Longhu, which produced 3 state teachers in succession. When the young Taoist priest who was carrying a lot of luggage heard this, he did not say anything. He only smiled and appeared naive. In the eyes of the old pilgrims, this was much more pleasing to the eye than trying to put in good words for Mount Wudong. They slowly climbed up the mountain. When they were close to the peak, they met an old Taoist priest who was sitting and looking at the sea of clouds. The old Taoist priest finally recognized the young Taoist priest who was carrying heavy luggage up the mountain. He quickly got up and bowed respectfully, saying, "Greetings to the chief." The young Taoist priest smiled and nodded, which could be considered a greeting. The dozen or so old pilgrims could not believe their ears. They all looked at the young Taoist priest who had accompanied them all the way and listened to how Mount Longhu was and how cold Mount Wudong was. They had indeed heard that the chief of Mount Wudong was surprisingly young. The main reason they came to Mount Wudong to burn incense was that they hoped to meet the new chief. They wanted to take a few glances at him from afar. It would be good to get some immortal air. No matter how Mount Wudong had declined in the past 100 years, it was still the ancestral court of Taoism that had once suppressed Mount Longhu. With the immortal Wang Zhonglo before them, the pilgrims still regarded the new chief as an immortal from the bottom of their hearts. But why is this young immortal carrying the luggage of us old men? Chapter 175. Reincarnated. After knowing the Taoists' identity as the Wudong sect leader, the old pilgrims did not dare to let the number 1 immortal on the mountain carry their luggage for them. The young sect leader could not dissuade the old people, so he could only accompany them all the way to the entrance of the Black Tortoise Hall on the Big Lotus Peak. There were few pilgrims. The young Taoist stood under a 1,000-year-old camphor tree and looked at the pilgrims holding incense and worshipping in all directions. Finally, they threw the incense into the huge incense burner. Wudong Mountain finally had some incense and smoke. He suddenly turned his head and saw a Taoist dressed in a Taoist robe outside the mountain. He held a white-tail horsetail whisk in his hand, and his hair was tied up in a bun made of boxwood. His expression was solemn as he slowly walked through the door. There was no dust on his body. Just by looking at his immortal aura, even the Wudong sect leader under the camphor tree seemed to be far inferior. The young Taoist slightly bowed to the uninvited guest. The slightly older Taoist ignored him and only looked into the Black Tortoise Hall. He could vaguely see the magnificent statue of Zhenwu Great Emperor in the hall. The statue was several feet tall, with long hair and bare feet. He wore golden armor and stepped on a black tortoise. The Taoist looked at the red bronze statue and then looked at the incense burner outside the hall. He shook his head and muttered, "Suppressing the demons and ruling the north, only Black Tortoise can stop him?" After becoming the sect leader of Wudong, the Taoist quietly stood far away. He heard the Taoist's question but did not directly answer. He only asked with uncertainty, "Probably." The foreign Taoist frowned. "Even you are not sure?" The young sect leader smiled and asked, "Mount Longhu said that you are the reincarnation of 3 generations of grandmasters. They also said that back then, Grandmaster Lu split the Azure Gall sword embryo into 3, and you obtained one of them. Tell me, is this true or false?" Unexpectedly, the Taoist shook his head without hesitation. "It's false." The new sect leader of Wudong was probably shocked and was speechless. On the contrary, the Dragon Tiger Taoist priest who was in another sect's territory appeared to be overbearing. Finally, he was willing to take a look. He looked at the number 1 person of Wudong whose aura and demeanor were not as good as any of the Taoist priests in the Taoist master mansion. He asked, "You're called Hong Shixiang?" The fellow called Hong Shixiang nodded his head, squatting down on the stone steps, exchanging glances with each other. Although the Taoist of Mount Longhu in front of him had an overbearing aura, it takes 2 to clap, isn't it? The person squatting there was neither red nor white in the face, as if he had seen a guest from afar, the kind that was half unfamiliar with him. Therefore, he was neither pretentious nor warm, nor did he have a cold expression. Thus, the confrontation between the two was not as tense as before, but instead, it was as if a chicken was talking to a duck. The visitor of Mount Longhu knew that he was called Hong Shixiang. Since Hong Shixiang knew about the Qingdan sword embryo, he naturally knew that this person with a great background had the surname Qi and the name Xianxia. Other than this name being unforgettable, it was more because this person with the surname Qi was not only famous in Mount Longhu and the Taoist master mansion, but also in the entire world of Taoism. Xianxia was a genius that was second to none. In the future, he was destined to be the pillar of the orthodoxy. The reason that Wudong knew was very simple. Little Wang Shixiang's swordsmanship was already outstanding enough. But Big Shixiang said that in the sex sword competition, Wang Xiaoping was only third. The second place was an old senior from a blessed paradise. Both of them were suppressed by the young dragon tiger Xianxia. Of course, rumors were just rumors. The truth had to be seen with one's own eyes. In Hong Shixiang's eyes, not only was the horsetail whisk in Xianxia's hand a sword, even the ancient tree under the 1,000-year-old camphor was also a sword. Moreover, they were all unsheathed swords. There was a popular saying in the Jianghu, "I don't hold a sword, but I have thousands of swords." It was probably a vivid portrayal of Xianxia. Hong Shixiang, who was squatting on the stone step, sighed heavily. Look, the foot of the mountain was full of powerful people and terrifying things. How dangerous! As for why Xianxia came up the mountain, Hong Shixiang was not really an idiot who did not understand the ways of the world. There were not many Taoist temples in Wudong, but there were also quite a number of them. It was inevitable that there would be some small conflicts between Taoist temples. If someone was not convinced, they would visit the temple every now and then to argue. In private, if the young Taoist lost in words, they would use their fists to reason. When he was young, he would ride a bull and wander around the mountains. He would always meet some juniors who had arranged to settle this privately, in a secluded place on the mountain. In the past, he was very happy to watch from the sidelines. Now that he was the chief, he could not clap his hands and cheer. He could only wait until the fight was over and then mediate. On Longhu's side, other than Xianxia, no one else was suitable to come to Wudong. The four great Taoist masters were old. Even if they won in a war of words, it would not be glorious. Among the young Taoist masters, Mr. White Lotus was invincible in debate. However, if Hong Shixiang did not care about what Mr. White Lotus said and agreed to it, Mr. White Lotus would probably be helpless. Xianxia was different. Was he really going to fight? Xianxia said that his Qingdan sword embryo was fake. However, no matter how Hong Shixiang looked at it, this guy's edge was hard to resist. Xianxia looked at Hong Shixiang's awkward expression. It did not seem to be fake. Although his state of mind was still calm, he had expected countless situations. He did not expect that the new chief of Wudong would be such an unambitious and irresponsible person. If he did not see Hong Shixiang carrying the luggage for the pilgrims when he went up the mountain, Xianxia would have smashed the statue of Zhenwu the Great Emperor. This was something that could be done with a few strokes of the horsetail whisk. As for whether Wudong and Longhu would become enemies because of this, Xianxia did not care at all. In the Taoist master's residence, for hundreds of years, they had a complicated attitude towards Lu Dongxian. No matter how good Lu Dongxian was in poetry and sword, he was still an old immortal on Wudong Mountain. There were countless immortals in Longhu Mountain, and there were also a few great Taoist masters. However, they did not seem to be as approachable as Lu Dongxian. Xianxia had long felt that compared to Lu Dongxian, the Taoist masters in Longhu Mountain's Zhao family's genealogy were more like clay statues in a Taoist temple. They were rigid and distant. They could not drink heroic wine or write soaring poems. They only looked high and mighty. Chapter 176. For a moment, the atmosphere outside the Hall of True Martial Arts was a bit cold. The older Taoist priests kept their distance. Only a few naive and ignorant little Taoist children gathered together to criticize the foreign Taoist priests. In the eyes of these children, whether the young martial granduncle was the leader or not, he was still the number one in the world. Wasn't the king of Bailiang His Royal Highness domineering enough? Wasn't he still subdued by the martial granduncle? Of course, this was mostly because they hadn't seen the scene of Su Fengnian beating up Hong Shixiang. But then again, even if they had seen it, the little Taoist children would only think that the martial granduncle was magnanimous and didn't lower himself to the same level as ordinary people. Xianxia took the initiative to ask, "Was the deed of thorough comprehension written by you? Was it not written by your senior brothers?" Hong Shixiang didn't answer the question. "There's nothing to entertain on the mountain, I'll give you one later." Xianxia frowned. Hong Shixiang suddenly asked, "Is the scenery of Jiangnan good?" Xianxia was silent. Hong Shixiang asked, "I heard that Longhu is quite close to Huding County. The weather there isn't cold, right?" Xianxia seemed to be annoyed by this kind of boring question. His tone became colder. "Why don't you go there yourself?" This time it was Hong Xixiang's turn to be silent. Probably thinking of Hong Xixiang's statement that he had never left the mountain, and then associating it with the occasional secret from the Taoist master's residence, Xianxia's expression became strange. He hesitated, then sneered. Huding County isn't cold right now, it's just that there's a big joke. Your king of Beiliang's eldest daughter Su Weisheng's improper conduct has angered everyone there. Even the capital has heard that there's a lady in the palace who wrote the precepts for women who is very angry, spreading the news that she's going to interrogate this princess who's married to Jiangnan. Hong Xixiang raised his head and asked seriously. Interrogate what? Xianxia said calmly. As the leader of Wudong, you're only concerned about this? Hong Xixiang smiled, pointed to the statue of Zhenwu Great Emperor in the hall and said, that person is concerned about the suffering of the people. As for me, I don't have the ambition to help the people like your Taoist master mansion. I only care about the warmth of the mountain. As for the situation at the foot of the mountain, I'm just asking. By the way, tell me, what is the crime? Xianxia ignored Hong Xixiang and looked at the devil-rinsing primogenitor in the dim hall again. He sighed softly and said, it has been 1,000 years since it was forged. Xianxia turned around and said, my path is different from yours. I will go to the Great Void Temple to take the ancient sword that ancestor Lu hung on the eaves. I don't know what crime she was charged with. All I know is that when the princess went to Mount Longhu to burn incense, she was stopped outside the mountain. Hong Xixiang stood up. He took a step forward. Back then, this young martial granduncle had stepped into the heavenly phenomenon realm. Today, he took a step closer and snatched the horsetail whisk from Xianxia, the sword chief of Taoism. On Mount Wudong, the long-awaited arrival of wind and thunder was welcomed. Su Shao of the Great Pillar State led the civil and military officials on the central axis. At the end of the imperial road that ran through the square, he looked up and saw the towering hall on the 3-story platform. The Palace of Preservation of Peace was the center of the dynasty, the center of the worship of thousands of dragons. To the entire world, the Palace of Preservation of Peace was just a square inch away. There were no more than 100 people standing here. However, the rise and fall of the empire depended on the people here and the government orders here. Even the slightest breath here would determine the health of the huge empire. The majestic platform on the 3rd floor had a railing carved from white jade, thick red wooden pillars, green eaves, and a golden glazed roof. It was extremely majestic and beautiful. A few years ago, the rear court of the imperial palace was burned down in a fire. Many palaces needed to be rebuilt. The stone and wood within a few hundred miles of the outskirts of the capital had long been cut down and excavated. Su Zhao's Beiliang transported countless giant stones and ancient trees here. One of the cloud dragon stone used as the stone steps of the rear eaves weighed 300 tons. One could see the extent of the labor and cost. At that time, complaints were heard everywhere. The remonstrant officials were even more excited as if they had been injected with chicken blood. They accused Su Shao of being a treacherous official, saying that the king of Beiliang was flattering and demanding excessive taxes. There were even people who said that if Su Shao did not die, the country would not be in trouble. However, the remonstrant officials who boasted of being untainted were really untainted. Su Shao was still the Su Shao who could get whatever he wanted. A high and powerful official who could not be moved. Walking on the central axis of the empire and reaching the end, one did not need to lower one's head. As long as one approached, one would see a huge wall of 9 dragons embedded in the ground. The 9 golden dragons were vivid and lifelike, as if they were about to soar into the sky in the next moment. On the left and right sides of the wall of 9 dragons were stone steps leading to the main hall. The civil officials walked on the left and the generals on the right. In the hundreds of years of the Liang dynasty, there had never been a fool who had walked on the wrong path. The older generation of officials all knew that every time Lame Su stepped onto the stone steps on the right side of the wall of 9 dragons, he would pause for a moment and mumble to himself, but no one had ever heard him clearly. Su Shao was born a martial artist, so every time he went to court, he would walk on the right side. No different from the first time he entered the capital. The imperial court had given him the title of Pillar of the Nation, and now it seemed that there was a bit of a drama going on. It was no wonder that the imperial court had been a chaotic mess back then, with people crying, kneeling, and furious. At this moment, the vast majority of the civil and military officials behind Su Shao had never discussed politics with this prince of a different surname. So many of them were paying attention to Su Zhao's movements after he walked up the steps. As expected, Su Shao glanced back at the southern imperial gate. But no one knew what the butcher Lame Su was thinking. Su Xiao thought that once he walked through that gate, he would truly have no choice. Normal people who approached the imperial gate would be questioned. Those who could walk into court would have a lot of glory and wealth, but as for how much they had to pay, that was a difficult question for each family. Even the ones sitting high on the dragon chair in the main hall found it difficult to ask. Since the founding of the Liang dynasty, it had never stopped. In the early stages of the restoration of the imperial gate, the assassination of Emperor Huanling by eunuchs in the Jiayin Palace, and then the attack on the Eastern Palace in the 6th year of Jiayin. Then there was the case of the scarecrow of Crown Prince Shan He, and the case of Emperor Runtai's sudden death from overdosing. Then there was the case of the moving of the imperial palace and the fight over the 3 official temples 50 years ago, and then the recent case of the white dress. The white dress. Su Xiao muttered to himself and then walked toward Baohe Palace. His eyes were cold. At the Maui embassy, he had already learned that not only had Feng Yan provoked the Qingzhou Navy on the Spring God Lake and been questioned by some people, even his eldest daughter, Su Weisheng, who had married off far away in Jiangnan, could not live a peaceful life. The group of bastards behind him really thought that his sword was just for decoration. On this day, Baohe Palace was in a great uproar. The world had only heard that after the court was dismissed, Su Xiao of the Great Pillar of Country had not even left the palace gates when he used the scabbard to cripple a third-rank official. Chapter 177. That night, they had bumped into the white-clothed Guanyin and the ghosts. Even though they couldn't find an inn after entering the city, it didn't matter to them. They wandered around for 2 hours. During this time, several groups of patrolling guards took the initiative to stay far away from them. In the end, Xu Xiu finally found a place to rest by the lake. As they walked, it didn't match with her impression of the ghost city of Fengdu. Inside Xiangfan, it was quite beautiful and prosperous. It was far from being comparable to the cities of Beiliang. King of Jing and Zhao Hang had spent 20 years of effort in managing the place. The inn was next to one of the most famous lakes in the world, Skinny Goat Lake. This lake had 10 sceneries. The inn was truly close to the water. It was reasonable for His Royal Highness to take out a large amount of silver as a stepping stone. Su Fengnian didn't immediately rest after he checked in. Instead, he sat on the second floor by the window and asked Blue Bird to boil a pot of wine. The green and white luan that Lu Qiu had brewed fell to the window. Blue Bird opened the secret letter and handed it over. After Su Fengnian finished reading it, he pinched it between 2 fingers and placed it on the candle flame to burn it to ashes. He gently blew away the ashes and couldn't help laughing. So lively. Blue Bird didn't interrupt. She just quietly looked at the young man sitting beside her. She looked at him for more than a decade. She also looked from a girl to a young girl to a woman. As a servant girl in the prince's residence, she didn't seem to work hard without complaint. Furthermore, the female servants in the manor were quite willing to work like cows and horses for His Royal Highness. As for Blue Bird, she didn't like to speak. Even when she smiled, she was reserved. As a result, she always gave people the feeling that she was like a piece of snow but as hard as iron. She wasn't as likable as the head servant girl of Wutong Garden, Sweet Potato. Su Fengnian had interacted with Blue Bird and had long become accustomed to this kind of self-talk. He very naturally continued to talk and laugh. The letter said that Su Xiao finally made a move. Outside of Baohe Palace, he beat a deputy agriculture minister half to death. That guy really doesn't have good eyesight. In the palace, not only did he talk about me playing around with the Qingzhou Navy, he also brought up a pot that didn't boil and said that my eldest sister's conduct was improper. If it were me in the palace, I reckon I wouldn't have the patience to walk out of the throne room. We need to quickly go to Gangnam-do and see my eldest sister first. Then we can immediately go see my second sister and Huang Manor. Eldest sister always says that Jiangnan's water and soil are good and that it has raised a street full of delicious girls, like baskets of green vegetables and radishes. I don't know if this is true or not. Blue Bird's smile was somewhat helpless. In fact, the stool was right in front of her, but she was still standing. She was very content. Su Fengnian drank a mouthful of wine and said with a smile, "The letter also said that the Jianghu is very lively right now. The civil, martial, rouge, and other rankings have all been released. The newly released top 10 masters of the martial arts rankings is still Wang Xianji. The position that Wudong's old chief vacated was given to a guy who didn't have any reputation before. He's a machete man from Beimang. I'm very curious as to where these rankings came from. It must be some well-informed fellow who dares to release these rankings." That old man Li beside us has just come out of the Tide Listening Pavilion, and he's already on the rankings. However, he's only ranked 8th, one place lower than that machete man. It's scary. The old god of swords may be one-armed, but he's made a lot of noise every time he fights. I really can't imagine how shocked the immortals and monsters ranked above him are. Sometimes when I look at the embroidered winter-spring thunder, I feel a little discouraged. I admit that I'm already very lazy when it comes to practicing the blade, but why do I always feel that I'm miles away from these guys? They say that once you enter a noble family, you'll be as deep as the ocean. I think it's better to change it to entering the Jianghu. Those who aren't on the rankings want to enter the rankings, while those who are on the rankings want to be in the top 3. Bluebird, do you think I'll go crazy one day and try to be number 1? Back then, my second sister didn't want me to practice the blade because she was worried about this. Was she afraid that I'd go crazy one day and not care about anything else? Bluebird hesitated. She wasn't willing to speak clearly. She only spoke in a small roundabout way. Practicing martial arts is always good. Su Fengnian rarely thought deeply about Bluebird's past. First, they had known each other since they were young. Second, Bluebird was not a complicated woman. Although Bluebird was not as close as Sweet Potato in Wudong Garden, Su Fengnian believed that in private, the servant girls in the courtyard would be more willing to talk to Bluebird about boudoir. Of course, these kinds of boudoir conversations were not about the love affairs of ordinary families. They were about the matters of the military and the state. Bailiang Palace was a place filled with swords and spears. Even the servants were stained with the arrogance of the imperial court. Since Su Xiao could be called the second emperor, then the Bailiang army was like a small imperial court. In this way, what difference was there between the prince's manor and a small imperial palace? It was just that Su Xiao never admitted these sensitive facts. Su Fengnian stroked the pair of scabbards embroidered with winter and spring thunder and suddenly laughed. Bluebird smiled. Su Fengnian retracted his fingers as if he had been caught in bed. Although His Royal Highness had 2 sisters, when it came to telepathy, it was like a worm in his stomach. Just now, when he touched the scabbards, he remembered that the pair of scabbards on the table were White Fox's beloved personal items that she had worn for many years. When he touched them, he always felt that he was indirectly touching White Fox's face. This really made Su Fengnian feel strange. He didn't have a fetish for cutting off sleeves. It was really because White Fox's face was too beautiful. Who was the champion of this Rouge Review? Wasn't it Nangong Push who was a man? When the mysterious Rouge House of Yunshan evaluated beauties, they would usually add more than 100 words to the beauty of the women on the list. Only Nangong Push was not mentioned in detail. They did not even mention his gender. When Su Fengnian first got the result, he laughed out loud. He thought that if the world knew that this guy was actually a man, would the woman behind White Fox's face be angry to death? At this moment, Su Fengnian loved the house and its crow. He was very curious about the woman on the list who was evaluated as not inferior to Nangong. He wondered why he had to meet her during this trip. Since White Fox's face was a man, he couldn't be his sister-in-law. Besides, he was doing closed-door training in the Tide Listening Pavilion, so there was no need to snatch the Bailiang. However, Chen Yu, who was evaluated as not inferior to White Fox's face, just happened to snatch back the Bailiang and give it to his brother, Huang Man. It was not a joke when he said that he would find a wife for Long Xiang in the early years. Su Fengnian got up and said, "Let's go to the lake." Outside the door, Lu Yangshu and the other 2 retainers took turns to keep watch. At this moment, it was Big Sword Lu Qiantang who was on duty. He silently followed behind the master and retainer. Lean Goat Lake was famous all over the world. In terms of scenery, Lean Goat Lake could be said to be the best in the north and south. There were more than 100 famous scenic spots in the annals of history. Back then, the selection of the 10 sceneries of Lean Goat Lake caused a big fight among the literati. They all had their own praises and fought until their faces turned red. In the end, the Grand Chancellor of Shangyin Academy came forward and gave the final word. Su Fengnian walked on the horse-riding embankment with Bluebird. The name of the embankment came from the idiom, looking at flowers while riding a horse. The 2 sides of the embankment were full of flowers. It was brilliant every spring and summer. Su Fengnian, who had nothing to do, picked up the winter embroidery knife and teased the embankment along the way, plucking countless flowers. Su Fengnian, who was strolling under the moonlight, was bored to death. He casually picked a topic and said softly, I'm sure the whole city of Xiangfan already knows that I've entered the city. Bluebird frowned and asked, was it King of Jing and Zhao Hang who spread the news? Is he trying to kill someone with a borrowed knife? Chapter 178. Su Fengnian nodded and smiled. But if I die inside or outside the city, it will be a headache for Zhao Hang and Zhao Sun. If a descendant of a vassal dies in a city under their jurisdiction, it will be harder to clean up their mess than if they were killed by arrows from the Qing province navy. If I don't add fuel to the fire in the city, I won't be able to determine if the Jianghu people will be able to kill me outside the city. No matter what, it is reasonable to say that the King of Jing won't have any direct contact with me. Bluebird, if I go to Jing'an Palace tomorrow, won't it be too much of a slap to Zhao Heng's face? This vassal king, in any case, was once the man closest to the dragon throne. These past few years, the dragon has roamed the shallows and the tiger has fallen to the plains. Do you think he won't get sick from holding it in? Otherwise, how could he have raised a son like Zhao Sun? Su Fengnian rambled on and on without the slightest scruple. Bluebird was his family, and Lu Qiantang was a fallen slave who had become a retainer. As a martial artist of Jianghu, he wouldn't be as concerned about these rebellious words as an official. As expected, Su Fengnian suddenly glanced at Lu Qiantang, who was only vigilant of the surrounding movements. His expression was meticulous. Near a pavilion, there was a thunderous snoring sound. A young man dressed in poor clothes was lying there. The sky was his blanket and the ground was his pillow. He was hugging a wooden sword. The sword was an ordinary sword style, but there was a wine gourd hanging from it. Su Fengnian originally wanted to walk past and not disturb the guy's golden millet dream, but he inadvertently saw half of the guy's face. Su Fengnian was stunned. Bluebird rarely saw His Royal Highness like this. For a moment, it was as if she was facing a great enemy. She was nervous. Lu Qiantang, who didn't let go of the slightest movement, immediately pulled out his sword. He thought that he had encountered an assassin with a great background. He didn't think that His Royal Highness would only quietly say, "You two stay away first." When Bluebird and Lu Qiantang were far away, Su Fengnian walked forward and lightly kicked the guy to the ground. The swordsman, who was startled awake, first had sleepy eyes. Then he began to curse. Then, he had the same expression as Su Fengnian when he saw him. His face was full of disbelief. He wiped the drool from his mouth and rubbed his eyes. Pleasantly surprised, he said, "Surnamed Su." How many times had he said it? But this bastard still wasn't willing to call out Su Fengnian's name. He always said that this name was too effeminate. It was so scholarly that it made him sound like he was from an aristocratic family. The next scene stunned Lu Qiantang. After the young man with the funny wooden sword confirmed His Royal Highness's identity, he punched His Royal Highness in the chest. However, His Royal Highness didn't get angry. Instead, he laughed and punched back. It was probably because that guy felt that Su Fengnian's punch was heavier than his own. In his life, he was the most calculative person. Feeling that he had suffered a great loss, he immediately rewarded Su Fengnian with another punch. In this way, Lu Qiantang saw His Royal Highness in the pavilion wrestling with a Jianghu boorish fellow who could smell the scent of poverty. This clearly exceeded the limits of Lu Qiantang's imagination. In the eyes of this second-level master, the Crown Prince of Bailiang wasn't someone who was easy to talk to. Not to mention that he dared to chase and beat up the great pillar state in the prince's mansion. He pinched Chu Lushan's fat face. Even after he left Bailiang, he first trampled on Qingyang Palace. Then he started the Battle of Spring Deity Lake. Everything happened one after another. When had he ever seen His Royal Highness being beaten like this? Why didn't he fight back? The swordsman Lu Qiantang was a second-rank swordsman with exceptional eyesight. Naturally, he could tell that His Royal Highness was holding back too much every time he attacked. He was striving to be no different from ordinary people. Lu Qiantang had never dared to think that there was anyone in the world who was worthy of this crown prince's careful treatment. Occasionally, when he was free, he would compare His Royal Highness with the other princes in the capital. However, he always felt that Su Fengnian was more domineering and powerful if they were to really fight. The young swordsman in the pavilion was not a poetic young swordsman sleeping on the lake. He was a stark contrast to Su Fengnian. Not to mention the wooden sword, the gourd he picked from the vegetable garden, dried it, and stored it in the sun to store wine. From head to toe, his clothes were really not worth more than 10 copper coins. On Mount Longhu, Xianxia wore hemp shoes. Moreover, The pair of hemp shoes on the little celestial master's feet did not need to be mended. Moreover, Su Fengnian was more certain than anyone else that the man in front of him was really poor. He was so poor that there were no jingling sounds in his pockets. Poor to the point that there were only 4 walls in his house? In any case, he had a home. After this fellow left home to travel, he could only call the 4 corners of the world his home. He did not know what to eat next. For a swordsman to reach this level, he could not be any more miserable. That guy had been starving for a few days, so he was completely listless from all the fighting. He lay back down and looked at Su Fengnian's luxurious clothes. With a face full of disbelief, he asked weakly, "Brat, which family did you steal the clothes of? You even have 2 good swords. They must be worth a lot of money, right? All right, I have to hurry to the top of the city wall to look at the portrait. There's a high chance that you're there. I'll report it to the government tomorrow." Su Fengnian sat on the side and leaned against a pillar. He laughed and said, "Wenhua, oh Wenhua, why don't you have some future prospects? I'm still waiting for you to make a name for yourself so that I can take advantage of you. Why are you still like this? You're just as sloppy as you were 2 years ago. How many meals have you not eaten?" Unsurprisingly, it was the young swordsman who would never be able to make a name for himself. He rolled his eyes and laughed as he scolded, "Stop talking nonsense. Su, if you still have some conscience, then take off this eyesore of a set of clothes and exchange it for some good wine and meat. Only then can we be considered brothers." Su Fengnian laughed and said, "All right, you can eat your fill with wine and meat." Wan Hua was stunned for a moment. He sighed and said, "Young Su, although you've changed your clothes, you haven't changed your conscience." Su Fengnian deliberately flicked his clothes with his finger and said, "I've long said that I'm one of the richest children in Bailiang. Do you believe me now?" Wan Hua said unhappily, "Who told you to pretend? Tomorrow, I'll make you invite me to the Xianxia alley to throw money. You'll be exposed." Su Fengnian asked, "The Xianxia alley?" Wan Hua chuckled and said, "White steamed buns." This was Wan Hua's catchphrase. Su Fengnian smoothly took over and said, "White is nothing but a lady's chest. Oh, is it a good brothel?" Wan Hua smacked his lips and said with a yearning expression, "The best place in Xiangfan City. A few days ago, I saw a leading lady in the Xianxia alley from afar. Just now, I was dreaming of doing it with her. In the end, I was King woken up by you. No, you have to compensate me." Su Fengnian slanted his eyes and said, "What are you pretending to be a hero for? Didn't you say that you won't lose your virginity before you return home in glory?" Wan Hua said helplessly and discouraged, "You won't allow me to enjoy my mouth." Su Fengnian asked, "Find a place to get some beef?" Wan Hua swallowed his saliva and shook his head and said, "The night ban in Xiangfan City is too scary. I can't tell if you're really wanted, or if you'll go out tomorrow to reward our internal organs." "That's right, where's old Huang?" "Why, last time, he accompanied you to suffer, but this time, he didn't accompany you to enjoy life? You're not honest, kid." Su Fengnian said calmly, "He's dead." Wan Hua haggled over small matters. If someone dared to give him less than a copper coin, he would dare to roll on the ground like a country shrew. However, he was rather open-minded when it came to important matters. When he heard the news, he was only shocked and regretful for a moment. He sighed and said, "If he's dead, then he's dead. He'll just reincarnate better. Where is he buried? If it's not too far, I'll burn incense and serve wine next Qingming festival." Old Huang was a good person. "I don't care about other people's lives, but I still have to go to old Huang's grave." Su Fengnian said softly, "He died at the Eastern Sea's Martial Emperor City. There's no grave." Wan Hua said in bewilderment, "Why did he run to the Martial Emperor City? If I remember correctly, old Huang was from Western Shu? That Western Shu accent, when I first met you guys, it almost made me want to commit suicide. These 2 years without old Huang nagging beside my ear, I'm rather lonely." "That's right, it's quite lonely." Su Fengnian looked at the moon in the middle of the lake and muttered, "It's quite lonely." Chapter 179. Wan Hua said angrily, "Su, watch your mouth. What servant girl's life? Be careful or I'll get angry with you." Su Fengnian rolled his eyes. Wan Hua raised his head to look at Blue Bird with his mouth full of oil, and he did his best to reveal the most graceful smile in his life as he said shyly, "Miss, Just because you called me young Master One, if that Su brat dares to bully you in the future, I'll be the first to take care of him. With his mediocre martial arts, I won't even need to use a sword to beat him down. Su Fengnian laughed loudly and teased, Young Master One, come, drink. Wenhua was in a great mood. It was the first time he'd been called Young Master Wen. His entire body felt comfortable, and he suddenly felt that besides the woman he adored in his heart, she was the second cutest woman in the world. Such a well-educated and virtuous woman was a servant girl? Only a ghost would believe that. Wenhua burped, and the remaining wine was carefully poured into his wine gourd. Wenhua threw a glance at Su Fengnian, and Su Fengnian shook his head. Wenhua nodded vigorously, causing Bluebird to be baffled. It was actually Su Fengnian who couldn't dissuade Wenhua, and he could only awkwardly ask Bluebird to carry the lunchbox back to the inn first. The two of them ran out of the pavilion like a wisp of smoke, and found a clump of grass near the water. They took off their pants and squatted down at intervals, and their bare buttocks were especially absurd under the moonlight. The two men ruined the scenery like this by taking a dump at Thin Goat Lake. However, if one knew about the hardships of those years, they wouldn't be surprised by the vulgar and despicable actions of this pair of buffoons at this moment. To a nobody like Wenhua who was crazy poor, the most F***ing happy thing in the world wasn't eating, drinking and sleeping, but the word shit. Because only when one was full would one have the capital to shit, and this was a very shallow principle. Wenhua, who was squatting by the lake, exhaled a long breath, and he said leisurely, Who knows, there might have been some poet or elegant scholar who recited poems here in the past. When I think of this I feel great. Su Fengnian did not say anything. He believed that King of Jing and Zhao Hang would never have thought that the Crown Prince of Bailiang would urinate and defecate beside the Thin Goat Lake. Wenhua was slightly bored when he saw Su Fengnian didn't move, and he suddenly smacked his lips in shock. Su, there's a stone tablet behind the place where I shit. Su Fengnian finally could not bear it any longer and cursed. That's the record of the Slender Goat Lake written by the governor of the previous dynasty, Li Mi. You son of a b***tch really know how to pick a place. Wenhua was speechless for a moment, and then he said in his heart, I've sinned. Su Fengnian hesitated for a moment before he asked softly, Wenhua, do you want to continue hanging out with me? Just like in the past, walking around and taking a look? If you run into another martial arts competition to find a spouse, I'll take care of you. Wenhua laughed and said, do you really think I'm stupid? Kid, you're amazing now, and I don't care who you are. In any case, I still think of you as a brother. But brothers are brothers. Although freeloading is natural law, if you're willing to part with money, I'm afraid I won't have the heart to endure hardships. So you go your own way, and I'll go mine. If we're fated to meet again, then we'll meet again. Wenhua, don't talk about anything else, but when it comes to practicing the sword, I'm afraid I won't have the heart to endure hardships again. Kid, I appreciate your good intentions. Tomorrow, I'll be leaving the city, and I want to go to the Beimang border to take a look. Just take it as broadening my horizons. Su Fengnian said softly, the border is going to be chaotic. You take it easy. Wenhua exclaimed in surprise, and joked, chaotic? Are you really the son of an aristocratic family from Bailiang? Su Fengnian said with a laugh. Isn't that so? Wenhua sighed and said, Earlier, I said I'd treat you to a meal of fine wine and meat, but I never thought I'd owe you another meal when we meet again. Su Fengnian said, You owe me then. Kid, just don't die, otherwise, there'll always be a chance to pay me back. Wenhua chuckled and said, According to old Huang's words, I'd have to say something like this at this time. Su Fengnian said absent-mindedly, That's right. Wenhua suddenly shouted, The blades of grass on my side are fucking ridiculously small. It's not easy to wipe my ass. It seems your side is a bit wider. Hurry up and throw some over. Su Fengnian cursed and threw over a clump of blades of grass. The two of them returned to the pavilion, and Wenhua asked, You're not going back to the inn? Su Fengnian shook his head and said, Let's have a chat. Tell me about that young lady of yours. The two of them chatted until dawn, and then Wenhua glanced at the dawn sky before he stood up and said, All right, I'm going out of the city. Help me remember the wine and meat that I owe you. Right, help me thank that good young lady. I've never been called young master by anyone in my entire life. Su Fengnian hesitated for a moment before he asked, I have an old senior that uses the sword by my side. Do you want to meet him? Wan Hua held the wooden sword tightly, and then he smiled as he shook his head and said, "No, that's someone else's sword in the end. Even if Senior is willing to teach me, I won't be able to learn it." Su Fengnian teased. "Didn't you always want to be taken as a disciple by an expert in the past?" Wan Hua said sternly, "I only thought about it. I remember old Huang said that practicing the sword requires sincerity, just like pilgrims praying to gods and Buddhas. Sincerity will work. But I've been idle for the past 2 years, so I've pondered over an unreasonable principle. The sword is my own. With my aptitude, if I walk the path of someone else, I won't be able to achieve anything in my lifetime. I don't have the habit of owing people. I can't really owe you a few meals of wine and meat until my hair turns white. Let's go. Don't be so wishy-washy like a woman." Wan Hua was full of smiles. "The steamed bun is white, but it's not as white as a young lady's chest." Su Fengnian's smile was intoxicating. "The tip of a lotus is perky, but it's not as perky as a young lady's butt." On the long embankment of the willows, the wooden sword Wan Hua and the dual blade Su Fengnian high-fived and brushed past each other. Chapter 180. Su Fengnian took a few steps and turned around to send off the man, the pot, and the wooden sword as they walked across the long dike. Bluebird stood there gracefully. Lu Qiantang had a solemn expression, but he was full of doubts. In the end, he could not guess the identity of the poor and pedantic young man. Given the wealth of Su Fengnian on the long dike, which was second only to the current emperor, it could be said that he was surrounded by nobles. The Dongyue swordsman had seen the liveliness of Bailiang Palace in the first month of the Lunar New Year. Those officials who enjoyed the shade under the big tree of the king of Bailiang could be said to be all feudal officials. When they met His Royal Highness, they had to put on an attentive smile on their faces. Lu Qiantang vaguely felt that the man with the wooden sword came from a humble background, but he did not dare to believe it. Or rather, he did not want to believe it. To this Bailiang servant, he would rather have Su Fengnian be a master who had no shrewdness. That way, it would be easier to serve him. 1 Su de Zugwo was enough for him to not dare to breathe. If Su Fengnian was an ambitious fellow with great talent and bold vision, then being in the king's company was like being in the company of a tiger. Today, he had provoked the king of Jing, and tomorrow, would it be the king of Guangling's turn? The day after tomorrow? How many years could Lu Qiantang, who still had a great pursuit of the way of the sword, live to practice the sword? Walking back to the inn with Bluebird, Su Fengnian asked and answered his own question. Wan Hua did not want to see Li Chungang, but if I mention the name of the old god of swords, don't you think that kid will regret it? Even if I want to roll on the ground, I will still leave. This is where I am not as good as Wan Hua. He always knows what he cannot do and does it. Back then, every time there was a martial arts competition for a spouse, he would eagerly go up the arena. When the other chivalrous men jumped up, he had to obediently walk up the stairs. He pretended to be thick-skinned, but in his heart, he cared more than anyone else about those supercilious looks. But no matter how many times he was beaten off the arena, he would still go up the stage whenever he had the chance, just to be able to exchange moves with others. But in the end, I did not see him return what he learned. Why bother? While he was talking to himself, Jiang and I and the old god of swords just happened to be out sightseeing at the Thin Goat Lake. Su Fengnian kindly threw a smile at them, but no one paid him any attention. After returning to the inn, Su Fengnian ate his breakfast and hid in his room to pick out the moves from the martial arts manuals in his mind. They were all the essence of the top-secret manuals, such as the Greenwater Pavilion Sword Training Manual and the Whale Killing Sword. Originally, it would be best to have Li Chungang to guide him in this kind of technical work. With Su Fengnian's little experience, he was far from being able to give advice. But even with his knees, he knew that the old god of swords, who dared to criticize the outline of 1,000 swords as worthless, would not even bother to move his mouth. Sigh, if only White Fox's face was by his side. However, on the ship, Li Chungang had taught Su Fengnian a mysterious way of flicking the sword. He explained the sword moves and sword aura in simple terms, which had already benefited Su Fengnian greatly. Originally, he was like an idiot who had a mountain of treasures in front of him. After picking and choosing, he finally knew what to do. Yu Yue carried Wu Mainyang and knocked on the door. After Bluebird opened the door, she said that she wanted to go sightseeing. Su Fengnian did not stop her and instructed Xu Xiu and Lu Qiantang to be her attendants. When Yu Yue saw that Su Fengnian had no intention of going out, Her expression became gloomy and her interest was somewhat reduced. Su Fengnian saw this and did not change his original intention. Jiang and I did not have time to study, so Su Fengnian had Bluebird go to the bookcase and pick out a few secret manuals. Among them, there was a secret manual on spear techniques called Arm Sutra, which was rumored to be written by the horse racing spear Wu Kuang. The reason why Su Fengnian was particularly interested in it was because Li Chungang had occasionally mentioned it. The old sword god took a few glances and asserted that this book was a secret record of the spear immortal Wang Xiu's experience when he was young. However, after he became famous, he found it vulgar and refused to admit it. Thus, he used the name of his direct disciple, Wu Kuang. When Su Fengnian flipped through the book, he saw that Bluebird's expression was abnormal. He asked, "Do you know Wu Kuang?" Su Fengnian was just asking casually. Unexpectedly, Bluebird nodded her head. Wang Xiu was one of the 4 grandmasters who were equally famous as Li Chungang. At that time, he was known as the world's #1 spear art. His junior brother was now Su Zhao's personal guard. Other than taking in Wu Kuang as his disciple, his most prized disciple, Chen Zhibao, had surpassed his master. It was rumored that he had died under the spear of a villain. However, for some unknown reason, Wang Xiu's weapon, the instant spear, had never appeared in the world after this grandmaster's death. Perhaps it was because Chen Zhibao's betrayal of his master was too unpopular, or perhaps it was because he wore a white robe and carried a sword all year round. It seemed that no one had ever taken this rumor seriously. When Chen Zhibao finished his apprenticeship, he was only in his early 20s. Even Wang Xiu was not as strong as Wang Xianxia. The older he got, the more immortal he looked. However, Chen Zhibao was indeed worthy of being Wang Xiu's disciple. Just like Wang Xiu's cold and murderous spear art, he pressed forward courageously on the battlefield, leaving no way out for himself or his enemy. However, even with Su Fengnian's identity, he had never seen Chen Zhibao's spear art. In his impression, this villain, who seemed to be in love with his second sister, Su Weisheng, only knew how to ride a white horse and wear a white robe. He was very amiable to everyone. Usually, he was gentle and kind like a bodhisattva who saved people from suffering. Su Fengnian was puzzled. "Have you guys fought before?" Bluebird shook her head. Su Fengnian saw that it was hard for her to say, so he didn't ask any more. Even though he was extremely curious, he held back his curiosity. Ever since he was young and saw her being led by his mother, he only knew that she was called Bluebird. After that, he never probed further. He was so used to it that he thoughtlessly forgot that as long as one was a person, they would have a surname and a name. For example, the maidservant's name was Hong Musk. Su Fengnian also knew that she was called Song Xiaofeng. As for whether Bluebird was her real name or just a nickname, Su Fengnian really didn't know. After returning from his travels, he learned that Wutong Garden was not a small pool where one could see the bottom at a glance. The maidservants were not simple vases without any stories. However, when it came to Bluebird, Su Fengnian selfishly hoped that she was just Bluebird, the girl that his mother had brought over to be his childhood sweetheart. Chapter 181. Arm scripture implied that the spear in one's hand was the third arm. The spear techniques recorded in the book were exquisite and profound. Su Fengnian roughly picked out 3 moves and counted with his fingers. 16 moves had already been painstakingly scoured out by Su Fengnian from various secret martial arts manuals. Aunt Zhao, who was keeping a low profile in the Qingyang Palace, said that he wanted to achieve 50 moves that were unrivaled under the heavens. However, not to mention whether the moves that Su Fengnian picked out could be incorporated into the blade, just looking at the number, it was still far from 50 moves. Ever since Su Fengnian personally witnessed the old god of swords using the flick of fingers on the ship, he developed the unique habit of flick of fingers. His finger lightly flicked the cover of Arm Scripture, and he gathered the 16 moves that could save his life in his mind. When he arrived in front of Shangfan City, the Great Yellow Court that was as deep as the sea and as inexhaustible as the Great Yellow Court was only at the 2nd floor realm. He could probably break 6 armors with one strike. However, the Dharma King of the Red Sect, who looked like a white-clothed guanyin, could see through 3 floors with one strike. Su Fengnian had weighed it and found that it was not a problem for him to break 9 armors with one strike. Even though it was only an increase of 3 armors, it was still a huge improvement. The most important thing was that when he used the Spring Thunderblade again, there was no stagnation like before. His right hand used the embroidery of winter, while his left hand used the Spring Thunderblade with the gravity of spring thunder. His techniques were completely different. This was where Su Fengnian's confidence in his 50 moves came from. In addition to the set of fist techniques of the bull riding Hong Shixiang and the wonderful deed of thorough comprehension, Su Fengnian was not so frightened by the old god of swords' few strikes that he did not dare to practice the blade. At noon, when they ate downstairs at the inn, they were all talking loudly and spitting saliva everywhere. Ginger listened with great interest. The old god of swords, who was wrapped in a smelly sheepskin fur coat, rolled his eyes and put one leg on the bench. He chewed on meat while picking his ear wax. The appearance of the civil and martial evaluations and the rouge evaluations was the most sensational event in the scholarly world in Jianghu. Perhaps it was because there was no first place in the civil and martial evaluations, but the martial evaluations and the rouge evaluations were still the most talked about. This generation of the martial evaluations did not disappoint. There were 18 first-level experts and the most talked-about top 10 experts. As expected, the master of the martial emperor city, Wang Xianji, continued to be the number 2 in the world. Next was the new god of swords, Dong Tai, who was ridiculed by the people of Jianghu for being the number 2 for 100 years. The third was still an old face, Chao Guanzi, who was praised as the most outstanding scholar in the world. Along with this came another big piece of news. Wang Mao, who occupied the 4th place, was ashamed to be ranked behind Chao Guanzi but was ashamed to be ranked ahead of Bei Meng, who was ranked 7th. Hong Jingyan, who was ranked 1st on the martial evaluations, was immediately pushed to the heart of the storm. He and the god of swords, Li Chungang, became the hottest topic of the day. In the martial evaluations, which did not only look at the level of martial arts but also the level of talent, there was an extremely interesting saying. It could be summarized as Guanyin, Guanyin, Zhenguan, South Lu Zuzu, and North Shenwu. Of the 4, Su Fengnian had already met 3 of them. The one who rode the bull, Wu Lu Ding of the sword tomb of the Wu family, and the female Dharmaraja dressed in white. The only remaining one was little Lu Xueqi Xianxia from Mount Longhu. However, the latter had already met Su Fengnian on the fishing platform. Other than the martial evaluations, the rouge evaluations also caused a great commotion. Nangong Push and Chen Yu occupied 1 or 2 of the martial evaluations. However, they were different from the other women who had long ago stunned the world. These 2 had never been famous, which made them even more attractive. But what Su Fengnian was most proud of was that not only did his second sister make a name for herself in the literature review, she also took the 1st place in the rouge review and vice review. Other than this, Wang Dongxiang, who took him on the turtle, also made it into the literature review and vice review. Although she didn't make it to the top, for a girl from a relatively ordinary family, it was a rare honor. Su Fengnian now understood why the gloomy father and son in the city had not made any moves. He glanced at the old god of swords opposite him who could attract countless supercilious looks. Everyone in Jianghu knew that there was this immortal who was known as the Green Snake in 2 sleeves and 1 sword by his side. The swordsmen in Xiangfan City who were itching to get rid of evil for the people would have to be 10 times more courageous. Who would dare to make a move? Zhang and I heard that some of the old god of swords in the restaurant had finally come out of seclusion, only to be the accomplice of a villain in Beiliang Palace. They all said that the old god of swords had become muddle-headed and that he could not protect his integrity in his later years. With old god of swords' attitude, it was likely that he would not be able to compete with Dong Tai for the title of the world's #1 sword. She was very angry, especially when she saw that the old man only cared about eating meat and drinking wine. She said indignantly, "Hey, didn't you hear them? They're all talking bad about you." Old Man Li said cheerfully, "I heard them. This old man is not deaf." Jiang and I was probably angry that he did not fight back. She put down her chopsticks and stretched out her small hand. She said angrily, "Give me back the talisman." The old god of swords pretended to be surprised and asked, "What?" Jiang and I repeated it again. The old man still pretended to be dumb and asked something. The little mudman stared at him a few times and finally gave up. She completely ignored this old man who could clearly split the river with 1 sword and let others talk bad about him. Su Fengnian was not amused by her childish behavior and laughed out loud. Jiang and I heard it and angrily said, "What are you laughing at?" "I'm not going to study today." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "If you don't laugh, then don't laugh. Let me talk to you. What kind of status does old god of swords Li have? Do you need to lower yourself to the same level as these short-sighted people? You can't let the old god of swords, the 8th master in the world, fight with these people, right?" Jiang and I snorted coldly and said, "Only the 8th. Su Fengnian used his chopsticks and pretended to hit Jiang and I. In the end, he did not really do it. Old Manly rubbed his chin and said, "Indeed, only the 8th. Which son of a bitch made the ranking? We need to talk about it. This old man was once the number 1 in the world. In this way, compared to the 11th master in the world, he is more miserable. We need to talk about it." Su Fengnian said regretfully, "My Huang Manor is actually not on the martial arts ranking sub-ranking. We also need to talk about it." The old god of swords laughed and said, "Although I haven't seen that idiot's physique with my own eyes, this old man reckons that this kid who was born at the Vajra realm will become a freak who is invincible under the mysterious realm in a few years." Long Hu Zhao Shituan. This old man had seen him a few times. This sloppy old Taoist's ability was not high, but his vision was not bad. In the next martial arts ranking, Su Longxiang will be able to secure a place in the top 3 if nothing unexpected happens. If someone like Wang Xianji does not appear in the pugilistic world in the next 20 years, it is even possible for him to fight for the championship. Of course, with someone like Wudong's Hong Shixiang who cultivated the heavenly Tao, it was hard to say that he was the number 1 in the world. This old man claimed to be invincible back then, but he was actually guilty. After all, he had never fought with Qi Xuanjun. That's strange. Su Xiao has 4 children. Su Weisheng and Su Longxiang are all extraordinarily gifted characters. Why is it that you, Sheila, can't fight normally? Su Fengnian laughed shamelessly and said, "We can't take all the good things in the world. We have to leave something for others to remember." At this moment, a group of young scholars walked in from outside the building. Their faces were full of anger as they cursed the immoral fellow for shitting in front of the records of the Slender Sheep Lake. Su Fengnian saw Jiang and I staring at him and asked, "Does it look like I did it?" Jiang and I laughed coldly and said, "It must be you." Su Fengnian gave a thumbs up and said, "Smart." Jiang and I could not eat anymore. Su Fengnian asked, "Are you really not going to study today?" Jiang and I put on a straight face. Su Fengnian asked again, "You spent 1 tael of silver on Mount Lao. Don't you feel heartache? Are you not going to earn money?" Jiang and I did not make a sound. But in the afternoon, she held a book and stood outside Su Fengnian's room. She did not knock for a long time. Su Fengnian did not make things difficult for her. He walked out of the room and said with a smile, "You're not going to study today, and I'm not going to listen. Let's go out and play." Chapter 182. Su Fengnian was kind enough to take Jiang and I out to relax, but she kept thinking about all the rumors she heard about the ghost city in Xiangfan. Admiring the lake with Su Fengnian was already the limit of her courage, so she did not dare to go out again. Even though Su Fengnian rarely made a losing deal and said that as long as she went out, he would treat it as if she had studied 10,000 words, Jiang and I did not hesitate to refuse. Su Fengnian could only give up. He could not tie her up and go out. Besides, the itinerary was Diaoyu Lake, where the yin qi was the heaviest. He reckoned that when the time came, she would fight him to the death. When Wang Yongming's army was defeated and the city was broken, he cut out his eyes and committed suicide on the city wall. His last words were that he wanted to keep his eyes to see how Su Xiao would lose his reputation. That place was not a good place to enjoy the scenery. Jiang and I did not go, and the old god of swords, who was the stabilizing force in the chaotic situation, naturally would not follow. Su Fengnian could only remove 3 of his retainers and bring along the halberd Ning Amei. Without waiting for Su Fengnian to ask Bluebird to call for people, Ning Amei strode over with a serious expression. After making sure that there was no one in the corridor, he said in a low voice, "Your Highness, King of Jing and Zhao Hang, is here." Su Fengnian was stunned. He narrowed his eyes and asked, "How many soldiers and armor did he bring?" Ning Amei shook his head and said in a low voice, "He did not bring any soldiers. Other than a few personal guards, he only brought Zhao Sun and a woman. She seems to be Princess Jing," and Su Fengnian was shocked beyond words by King of Jing'an's antics. Could it be that he had brought his wife's collar to beg for forgiveness? Otherwise, he would not have let Princess Jing'an show her face in public. The fact that he did not bring any armor, spears, or halberds was already enough of a show of sincerity. For example, Su Xiao had never been courteous to the wise. When you came to his residence, he had already given you enough face by opening the front door. No matter how useless the King of Jing'an was, not to mention how glorious he was in the past, he was now one of the 6 great vassal kings. If he abided by the law of the vassal kings, he would not dare to muster a large force, but why would he need to come in person? How was that possible? Su Fengnian furrowed his brows as his thoughts raced. For a moment, he did not notice that Ningame was sizing him up. Outside the room, Jiang and I was holding a book with an indifferent attitude, as if even if the sky fell, His Royal Highness would be there to support it. On the other hand, the meticulous blue bird saw Ningame's expression, and immediately felt an indescribable murderous intent. Ningame seemed to have noticed it. He slanted his eyes and smiled calmly at Blue Bird. Su Fengnian was thinking about how to deal with this situation, and ignored the confrontation between Blue Bird and Ningame. He paused for a moment and smiled. "Let's go, General Ning. Let's go and take a look. I heard that Princess Jing'an is an extremely charming beauty. If I remember correctly, she is one of the beauties in this Rouge Review. She is almost 40 years old and still able to be on the list. She must be a very beautiful woman." Ningame smiled and led the way. The appointment was to be held in a secluded room in the corner of the inn. Unknowingly, Lu Yangshu and the other two had gathered behind Su Fengnian. By the time Su Fengnian entered the room, even Li Chungang was standing silently in the corner. At the door stood two imperial bodyguards of the Prince of Jing'an's estate, who were in the prime of their lives. Their auras were strong and unending. One of them wielded a saber, while the other was empty-handed. There was a scent of the battlefield that Su Fengnian was no stranger to about them. The old soldiers in the army always said that even ghosts would be afraid of people who crawled out from a pile of hundreds and thousands of corpses. This was because their bodies were tainted with an extreme yang aura that was snatched from the corpses. Therefore, whenever the Bailiang soldiers mentioned the Pillar State in Xiangfan City, they would always proudly say that hundreds of thousands of wandering ghosts were nothing. As long as the great general entered the city alone, those filthy otherworldly items would not even be able to become ghosts. They would perform the 36,000 great ritual of the heavens. The two imperial bodyguards who had just left the battlefield did not stop Su Fengnian. Presumably, the king of Jing'an, Zhao Hang, was famous for his shrewdness. Since he was willing to sacrifice his face and personally enter the inn, he would not delay the important matters. Su Fengnian, who was armed with two sabers, did not knock on the door. Instead, he directly pushed the door open. The eldest son of Xiangfan, the crown prince of the king of Jing'an, Zhao Sun, was standing with his head lowered. A middle-aged, elegant man was sitting on a chair, twirling a string of 108 Tiantai Bodhi beads in his hand. He was reciting the names of the three treasures. His face was unusually pious. Although he was already in his 40s and would soon be over 50, he still had an outstanding demeanor. At first glance, one could tell that he was a handsome man with a jade-like face when he was young. According to the unofficial history, the king of Jing'an was most favored by the Empress Dowager and was given the nickname Tan Lang because Zhao Hang had been handsome since he was a child. In addition, he was pure filial and docile, so he was able to enjoy the Empress Dowager's love among the princes. After he was crowned, he became even more outstanding and elegant. According to the official history, the sixth prince was good at riding and shooting. He held a long spear in his hand and rode a horse. It was enough to show that Zhao Hang was unparalleled in the past. However, after Su Fengnian entered the inn, he did not go to see Zhao Sun or the king of vassal who had failed at the last step. It was not that Su Fengnian pretended to be arrogant, but that the woman in the room was too eye-catching. She happened to be sitting sideways. Her body was graceful and graceful. The woman was reading a book. When she turned the page, she lifted the hair on her temples. She was beautiful, and her demeanor was even better. She was classical and graceful, just like a fairy maiden in a painting. Hearing the door open, she turned her head and smiled gracefully. The beauty's smile could topple a city. Su Fengnian's eyes were in a trance. Crown Prince Zhao Sun lowered his head and caught a glimpse of this scene. The malice in his eyes grew. He quickly lowered his head and gritted his teeth without saying anything. The hair on the king of Jing and Zhao Heng's temples were gray. Perhaps it was because he had used too much scheming in his life that he was old. Fortunately, a man's temperament was not affected by age. However, compared to Princess Jing'an's beauty who was not past her prime, she was still as radiant as ever. It was somewhat a mismatch. They were already 10 years apart, and now this old man looked even more like a young wife. The world only knew that the princess came from a noble family in the spring and autumn period. Her father was Pei Kai, the the most knowledgeable scholar in Western Shu. He was known as Pei Huang Lao. He was famous for being weak, and was especially proficient in the Lao and Yi. He was above the secular world and was fully deserving of the title of a great scholar of the classics. The Pei family withered during the unjust war of the spring and autumn period. Pei Kai died for his country, leaving behind only an orphan. The orphan of the fallen country married into a noble family. A beauty matched with a noble. Su Fengnian only looked deeply at Princess Pei. In the eyes of others, he was a licentious lecher who was extremely rude. A palace guard was about to close the door when Lu Qiantang acted as if he was about to draw his sword. With his back to the door, Su Fengnian coldly said, "Impudent! Don't be rude." He allowed the door to slowly close. King of Jing and Zhao Hang did not rise to greet him. After he finished chanting, he hung the prayer beads and tied them to his well-maintained hands. He raised his head and said warmly, "Fengnian, there are no outsiders here. You and I can call each other uncle and nephew." Su Fengnian restrained his arrogance and returned the favor. He said warmly, "Nephew greets Uncle King of Jing'an." Chapter 183. Perhaps Zhao Hang did not expect the notorious crown prince of Bailiang to be so easy to talk to. His eyes darkened as he gently pinched a Bodhi prayer bead between his index finger and thumb. With a gratified expression on his face he said, "Brother Su, a tiger does not beget a dog. Back then, I could not compare to him in terms of horsemanship and had no choice but to lose to him in every aspect. It was inevitable that I was unconvinced and thought that I had to make up for it somehow. My son, Zhao Sun, was not suited for martial arts, so I forced him to study hard. I was afraid that even my son would not be able to compare to Brother Su. Today, it seems that I still failed to flatter you and lost by a large margin. By the way, Fengnian, Uncle Wang took the liberty of coming here this time to bring this stupid boy from studying to apologize to you. Zhao Sun's reputation is thin. Even if he knows that he is in the wrong, he would not dare to come here. He had no choice but to ask his mother to step forward and escort him here. I have made a fool of myself in front of you." Princess Fei's laughter could topple a nation. Zhao Hang looked at his son, Zhao Sun, with a faint smile on his face. Even when Su Fengnian slapped his face with Xiaodong on the yellow dragon ship, the latter did not bat an eyelid. When Su Fengnian made fun of him for diving into the water, he jumped so confidently and calmly. However, when his father glanced at him today, it was as if he had been stung by a poisonous object. He immediately raised his head and bowed deeply to Su Fengnian with a solemn expression on his face. It could be said that he was solemnly apologizing to his sworn enemy a few days ago. He only lacked a smile to wipe away the enmity between them. Su Fengnian pulled a chair over and sat down. He stared at Princess Jing'an's beautiful face for a while, then turned to the King of Jing'an and said with a smile, "This nephew was reckless. How could I accept Brother Su's bow?" Although he said that, he did not have any intention of getting close to Zhao Sun. He accepted the King of Jing'an's apology with a clear conscience. Zhao Hang smiled at this, sitting upright on a Taisha chair pieced together from red sandalwood. No matter how luxurious the inn's decorations were, they couldn't afford to use rhinoceros horn sandalwood or rooster blood sandalwood to make a chair. Red sandalwood was ranked last among red sandalwood. Its texture was relatively loose, and its luster and texture were far inferior to the other two. However, red sandalwood usually grew slowly, and it didn't have any great material. Ordinary high-ranking officials and dignitaries would be grinning from ear to ear if they had a sandalwood chair. Scholars and poets would love a small sandalwood fan so much that they believed this low-grade red sandalwood chair was already the inn's housekeeping treasure. King of Jing'an's nickname was Sandalwood. His love for red sandalwood was only second to Little Ginger's imperial uncle from West Chu, who had built a sandalwood palace. Zhao Hang said that he would not sit unless it was sandalwood, nor lie down. It seemed that this was not an exaggeration. Su Fengnian looked at the 108 mani pearls in Zhao Heng's hand and praised, "Uncle Wang is indeed a devout believer of Buddhism." When the Tian Tai Bodhi seed was plucked, it was a hard golden yellow. Most eminent monks would only turn from golden yellow to pale yellow after holding the pearls for several decades. In Uncle Wang's hands, it turned from pale yellow to milky white. As the old saying goes, sincerity can move metal and stone. With Uncle Wang's sincerity, what bodhisattva would not bless you? King of Jing'an laughed and said, "I have long heard that Fengnian and I worship Buddhism. It seems that it is true." Xianxia, on the other hand, Still can't recognize that this is a Tiantai Bodhi seed. Last year on my birthday, Xianxia took the initiative to give me a string of walnut prayer beads. Although each walnut was carved with 6 luohan, according to the Buddhist Sutra of measuring and counting beads, the material of the prayer beads is different. Therefore, the merit obtained during practice is greatly different. The core is only 2 times, the iron is 5 times, the copper is 10 times, the lotus seed is 10,000 times, but the Tiantai Bodhi seed in my hands is 10 million times. Fengnian, if it were you, would you want the rope used to tie the walnut or the string in Uncle Wang's hands? Su Fengnian was surprised and said, if I remember correctly, the Vajra seed prayer beads are 10 million times the merit, and the Tiantai Bodhi seed is the most superior of all. Zhao Heng's 2 fingers clasped the faded color of the Tiantai Bodhi seed. He squinted his eyes and said with a smile, after all, Uncle Wang is old and always remembers incorrectly. He has to admit that he is old. Princess Jing'an's appearance and bearing were like that of an empress. Perhaps she was infected by the harmonious atmosphere. She lost some of her deliberate dignity. 2 slender fingers pinched a page of a book and 1 hand rested on her cheek as she looked sideways at Su Fengnian. Her eyebrows were naturally charming. It seemed that she was quite curious about His Royal Highness from Beiliang who had come from afar. The junior in front of her could no longer be considered a child. Even in Qingzhou, there were many sayings about him, including the Su family's phoenix who was a prodigal son of the family. Moreover, Xiangfan had been destroyed by Su Xiao and Wang Yongming. The majestic city had once become a ghost city. The scholars of Qingzhou knew that they could not convince the king of Beiliang with words, so they took pleasure in wantonly criticizing the hedonistic behavior of the crown prince of Beiliang. Su Fengnian and Princess Pei looked at each other and said with a smile, Auntie is really beautiful. Princess consort Jing'an stared blankly for a moment. Zhao Heng gently pinched the prayer beads he was using to suppress his delusional thoughts and took the opportunity to joke. Your auntie is naturally good-looking. In the year of the phoenix, is there any noble young lady from Qingzhou that you fancy? Uncle Wang can help you snatch her away. Su Fengnian's skin was as thick as the walls of Xiangfan. He climbed up the pole and said shamelessly, originally, I was thinking about a Qingzhou lady that I met by chance on the Spring God Lake. What was her name again? I remember now, Lu Xiu'er. I think her family's ancestor was the old minister of the Pillar State in the capital. In terms of family background, she could be a good match for me. But after seeing Auntie today, I don't want to think about her anymore. Zhao Heng dismissed it with a smile. Crown Prince Zhao Sun was so angry that his lips were ashen and his entire body was trembling. Fortunately, he was standing to the side with his head down. Next to the king of Jing'an and princess consort, he was very inconspicuous. What followed next was an even more boring chat. Borrowing the momentum of the civil, military, and rouge reviews, there was no lack of topics to talk about. Su Fengnian's eloquence had long been honed by the courtesans of Beiliang to a profound level. It was more than 10 times better than his knife skills. When the king of Jing'an mentioned that the review this time only lacked a general review, he even spoke up for Su Xiao, who had humiliated him in the past. This time, the general review did not appear. The reason was that there were no famous generals after the spring and autumn period, and after the spring and autumn period, there were only blue eyes. Since the general review could not produce anything, why would there be a need for another review? However, anyone with a discerning eye could see that this statement greatly praised the current Chancellor Zhang Julu. It almost pushed him to the height of being able to support the country alone. The king of Jing'an and Zhao Heng finally stood up. Su Fengnian gently bowed and said goodbye. When leaving the room, of course, Zhao Heng should be the first. Originally, Princess Pei should be the second, followed by the junior Su Fengnian and Zhao Sun. Su Fengnian, intentionally or otherwise, lagged behind a few steps. Princess Pei's temperament was indifferent. In addition, the shameless Zhao Sun was in a hurry to escape. Thus, Su Fengnian and Princess Pei walked side by side. When they crossed the threshold, this beauty from a noble family trembled. Her autumn eyes, filled with the aura of Jiangnan, widened. With an expression of disbelief, she looked at the young man who had repeatedly called her aunt. How dare he? Su Fengnian had an innocent expression on his face. He softly said, Aunt, nephew has chosen a pair of bracelets. In a moment, I will have someone send it to the prince's mansion. Her ears were completely red. She did not make a sound. Her buttocks, which were covered by the brocade robe, felt waves of numbness. How dare he be so licentious and absurd? Chapter 184. When King of Jing and Zhao Hang heard this, he didn't seem to notice Princess Pei's strange expression. He turned his head and smiled. Feng Yan is very considerate. Su Fengnian laughed and said that it was something he should do. He walked them out of the inn and waited until the three of them got on an ordinary carriage. It was obvious that the carriage was quite narrow. The horses were good horses that even wealthy families could afford. Other than the two strong and sturdy attendants and bodyguards, everything was quite plain. This family of three, who was only one step away from owning the imperial palace in the capital, came and went quietly. On the surface, they were full of the Buddhist aura of a believer in Buddhism, the fairy aura of a beauty, and the friendliness of a distant relative. However, who could understand the murderous intent behind each step? Only Bluebird saw that after leaving the room, His Royal Highness didn't show his back to King of Jing and Zhao Hang. His lapel was already soaked through. The Crown Prince of Bailiang looked at the flying dust at the end of the road and finally turned around peacefully. He ordered Bluebird to buy a copy of Qingying Study House's version of The First Snow. Then he walked back to the room alone and closed the door. He sat on the chair that was still warm and let out a long breath. He looked at the sandalwood chair and murmured, "In just a few hours, Zhao Hang has already pinched the prayer beads 4 times. Su Xiao was right. This sanctimonious king of Jing and is as vicious as a woman. Zhao Hang probably doesn't know that I have long known about his secret habit of killing people with each pinch of the prayer beads. The first pinch of the Bodhi beads was because he was surprised that I wasn't as rebellious as the rumors said. He began to suspect that my absurd behavior in Bailiang over the years was because I was pretending to be stupid. Secondly, he was angry that this Xixi's memory was not bad. He clearly remembered what was written in the Buddhist Sutra of measuring pearls and counting pearls' merit and virtue. He was able to see through his deliberate mistakes. The third pinch was to abhor my undisguised desire for Princess Pei. As for the last pinch, it was interesting. He actually crushed a Tiantai Bodhi seed that was as hard as gold and stone. I originally thought that he was going to shed all pretenses of cordiality, but I didn't expect that Zhao Sun's mental fortitude was already so good. This old man is even more experienced and ruthless. It seems that after pretending to cultivate and pray to Buddha for several decades, there are some results. In terms of acting skills, he is indeed better than me." Su Fengnian's words were teasing, but his tone was terrifyingly gloomy. He shook his uncomfortable clothes and leaned against the chair, repeating scene after scene in his mind. He recalled every detail of King of Jing'an's movements, Princess Pei's subtle frowning and relaxing, Zhao Sun's slight raising and lowering of his head. Finally, Bluebird entered the room with a set of Wang Dongxiang's The First Snow. Su Fengnian took the book, narrowed his eyes, and stood up to change his position. He sat on the chair that Princess Pei had sat on. With a hoodlum smile on his face, he raised his hand and clenched his 5 fingers. He changed his face into a mask and said in an intoxicated manner, "Comfortable. The tip of the lotus flower is raised, but it can't be higher than Xiaonyang's butt." Even though Wan Hua's words are crude, he directly said the great principle that scholars have to spend a lot of money to buy. Bluebird was confused. She did not see the unrestrained undercurrent at the door. She reckoned that Su Xiao was the only one in the world who dared to think deeply about Su Fengnian's daring feat. Su Fengnian pondered for a moment, then took out one of the books, The First Snow, printed by Qingying Study Room, and flipped through a few pages. If King of Jing'an and Princess Pei were present, they would definitely be shocked by the amazing memory of this nephew of Bailiang. He remembered that in the Sutra of Buddhist Studies and Counting of Beads, the multiplier of the merit of prayer beads was nothing. This was because the pages that Su Fengnian flipped through were exactly the same as the pages that Princess Pei had skipped through several times. Thinking about the subtle changes in Princess Jing'an's expression every time, Su Fengnian lowered his head to look at the contents of the book. With a strange smile he said, "This beautiful auntie does not seem like a woman who is soft on the outside but strong on the inside. Pei Kai, who was born in a rich and powerful family, is an unyielding literary hero. How could he train such a weak and delicate daughter? Compared to the women of Qingzhou who like to fight and scheme the most, she could be said to be a weirdo. I reckon that if this auntie was not so beautiful, she would not have been able to sit firmly in the position of Princess Consort of Jing'an Palace. Previously, I heard that little girl Lu Xiu'er said that Princess Pei had caused the death of Zhao Sun's mother to be able to sit as the princess consort, and I believed it to be true. This little girl's skin has done a lot of harm. The next time I see her, I won't just touch her small hands and waist. Su Fengnian asked, Bluebird, where is the sandalwood box that I asked Wang Linquan to buy on Mount Lao? Go get it. Bluebird quietly left and returned. Su Fengnian opened the exquisitely crafted sandalwood box. Inside, there was a string of prayer beads that were rarely seen in the dynasty. The material used was called Pa Luo Zi in the western regions, and the people of the Central Plains were used to call it Crown Prince. This kind of prayer beads would not be cold in the winter, and would not be stained with sweat in the summer. The Crown Prince was strung together in a circle, and had a very artistic name, Satisfaction. It was a wonderful object that could not be bought with money. No matter who it was given to, it would not be degraded. If it was given to someone who believed in Buddhism, it was even better. Su Fengnian's original intention was to test the king of Jing'an fiercely when he arrived at Xiangfan. If they could coexist peacefully, he would give this precious bracelet to him. If they turned against each other, he would keep it for himself and give it to Miss Li, who had lived in the temple since she was young. That way, it would be more agreeable to her. It was just that in the time it took for a spark to fly off a piece of flint, Su Fengnian was worried that the king of Jing'an would see through the truth. He did not want to give Zhao Sun the impression that he was a cultured person on the outside, but a scheming person on the inside. Therefore by chance he came up with that stroke of genius. TSK. 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 That feeling was superb. Su Fengnian closed the First Snow in the East Wing book, which had won the title of The First Snow in the East Wing. He said, in a moment, have Ningame deliver this sandalwood box to the Jing'an palace. Tell him to give it to Princess Pei. I don't believe that the king of Jing'an, this 1,000-year coward, can continue to endure at home. If you make me unhappy, I will set your house on fire. Bluebird softly agreed. Su Fengnian suddenly asked, Bluebird, if I say that bastard Zhao Sun has some kind of abnormal fantasy about Princess Pei, would you believe me? Bluebird calmly said, I believe you. Su Fengnian laughed coldly and said, this family looks like a group of harmonious people, but turns out it's just a facade. So what if Zhao Sun has pinched the prayer beads 1,000,000 times? Holding the prayer beads in one's hand can increase one's concentration and wisdom. Su Xiao has already made it clear that he is too smart for his own good. Those who achieve great things must not use petty tricks and cleverness. Zhao Sun is a person who cannot let go of anything. If he is willing to let go of something, if he is unwilling to let go, how can he gain anything? Chapter 185. Su Fengnian laughed and said self-deprecatingly, it seems like I'm a coward who was scared out of my wits. I don't have the right to criticize someone as ambitious as Zhao Hang. The king of Jing and Bluebird smiled and shook her head. Zhao Hang has already lost the first move in his discussion with your highness. Su Fengnian smiled and said, don't flatter me. The reason why I was able to win by a fluke was because Su Xiao set up the most domineering first move for me. It wasn't my true ability. Humph. I'm still so useless today. It's all because Bluebird and you girls flatter me. Go, serve tea as punishment. Bluebird smiled and remembered something. Her expression turned cold as she said, Ningame was disrespectful towards King of Jing'an's visit. He wanted to see how your highness would respond. Su Fengnian waved his hand and said, it's reasonable. Ningame is a brave warrior who can wield a heavy halberd weighing 70 to 80 kilograms. How could he be willing to risk his life for others? Speaking of which, if he kowtowed to me as soon as he saw me, I would suspect that he was a traitorous fence-sitter. Don't mind this small matter. Otherwise, Ningame will laugh at me and look down on me even more. Su Fengnian continued, in the past, when I heard Su Xiao talk about his experiences, I didn't take it to heart. Now that I look back, I understand a little. Killing an enemy on horseback is all about risking your life. If you win, you're the boss. If you lose, you're the grandson. It's clear. What a headache. No wonder Su Xiao said that scholars were the most ruthless and merciless when killing other scholars. Zhao Heng is one of the most sinister people. Sure enough, to practice the saber, you need to personally fight with the enemy. To develop shrewdness, you need to fight with masters like King of Jing'an to gain experience. I don't feel bad about giving you a string of satisfaction worth thousands of gold. Bluebird took the sandalwood box and left the room, gently closing the door behind her. Su Fengnian took the time to quickly read the last book, The First Snow. Every word was like a gem. He really couldn't understand how a 16-year-old girl could write such a vivid essay. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that her writing was ingenious. Last time when his elder sister went back to Baelyong, he always heard her sigh that she wished the world could have another snow. At that time, he only felt that his elder sister was too sentimental. Now that he flipped to the end, he saw that the ground was covered in snow, and the tragic ending was a clean death. He felt both heartache and peace of mind. It was as if not dying was a failure, and only death was a real life. In the past, Su Fengnian didn't have such a state of mind. If someone died beside him, he would appear to be indifferent, but in fact, he would always be worried for a long time. It wasn't until 3 years ago when he had to walk around in a difficult situation, experiencing hardships and seeing the world's various forms of life that he changed. Su Fengnian said softly, "Old Huang, are you trying to say that my home is where my heart is at ease?" Su Fengnian, who was sitting alone, laughed. "Hey, how can you say such a literary principle?" In one of the rooms of the inn, Jiang and I was lying on the table, staring at the dozen or so copper coins. She had asked the stingy Su Fengnian for one tael of silver that originally belonged to her. In the end, along the way, she was reluctant to buy anything. With great difficulty, she had steeled her heart and only picked 2 sets of the cheapest clothes and a cheap wooden hairpin. There were still some copper coins left. She was used to living a poor life. The little clay figurine seemed to have long forgotten the noble demeanor of growing up in the imperial family when she was young. No matter how angry she was at His Royal Highness, no matter how angry she was to the point that she could not eat, it would not affect her studies to earn money. These days, after leaving the Baelyong Palace, where everyone looked at her with disdain, she saw the scenery of the outside world. It was beautiful, but Jiang and I was not as interesting as she had originally imagined. If it were not for the company of old Li, she privately felt that it would not be as good as Wudong Mountain. Over there, she could still have a vegetable garden. Looking at the little green, she always had some joy that she did not dare to admit. Originally, she secretly hoped that she could spend the winter on the mountain. That way, she could build a snowman as tall as a person. Then, she would not have to be as restrained as she was in the palace. She could viciously stab the snowballs in front of that hateful fellow. But in the end, she still went down the mountain. It was just that Jiang and I, whose hopes had been dashed, wasn't too upset. This was his fate after all. What was there to complain about? The heavens couldn't hear him anyway. Old God of Swords Li came to the house and sat down. He tossed peanuts into his mouth and chewed loudly. Jiang and I was still staring at the copper coins in a daze. He said absent-mindedly, "Left." Old Man Li nodded and said, "Boring. This king of Jing isn't a man at all. He's so cowardly even in his own territory. To think that he can hug such a plump and pretty lady and roll around in bed every night. He doesn't even have the slightest bit of heroic spirit." Originally, this old man didn't think much of that Su brat no matter how he looked at him. Today, after seeing the imposing manner of Jing and his son, he finally thinks that Su brat is cute. Jiang and I raised his head and glared at him. The old God of Swords smiled embarrassedly. He knew that his words wouldn't be pleasant to the little mudman's ears, so he didn't add fuel to the fire. He was just starting to get annoyed. This old man had already put down his airs and wanted to watch Su Fengnian practice his swordsmanship. This little brat, on the other hand, hadn't done anything for so many days from Mount Lao to Xiangfan. He didn't know how lucky he was. To be able to get a few pointers from this old man. How many people yearned for an opportunity that they couldn't get? Li Chungang was an old fox that couldn't be any older. In fact, he had already guessed some clues. Su Fengnian had a cautious personality. To put it nicely, he had an outstanding temperament. To put it bluntly, he was as timid as a mouse. For the sake of the imperial court, he could resist getting close to women. For the sake of secrecy, he wouldn't easily reveal his swordsmanship in public. Occasionally, Li Chungang really wanted to use his finger to fiercely poke that brat's forehead and ask him if he was happy living like this. He was clearly a master who could cross the river no matter where he went, but what difference was there between him and a scoundrel struggling at death's door? Jiang and I sighed and said, "That Sister Guanyin outside the city is so beautiful. The one today is also very beautiful." The old God of Swords laughed and said, "Little Jiang and I isn't any worse than them. In another 2 years, you'll be even more beautiful. It's fine as long as a woman is young. This old man dares to say that they're all jealous of you." Jiang Ni's eyes lit up and asked, "Really?" The old man rolled his eyes and said, "Why would this old man lie to you?" Zhang and I immediately squinted his eyes and smiled. The two little dimples on his cheeks made even the old god of swords want to go drink. The old man was somewhat helpless. Zhang and I carefully put away the copper coins like a miser. He jogged to the bookcase and picked up a secret manual. Fine, he was obediently reading and earning money again. As a result, the old god of swords felt even more helpless. Chapter 186. The carriage coming out of Jing and Palace looked simple and crude, but in fact, it was a world of its own. The interior walls were made of high-quality sandalwood, and there was a gold-plated sandalwood incense burner with a fine jade base. After Princess Pei boarded the carriage, she placed the book, The First Snow, on the table, crossed her legs, and rested her plump buttocks on them. She skillfully reached out to burn the sandalwood incense. The king of Jing and Zhao Hang, and the crown prince, Zhao Sun, sat facing each other. Zhao Hang closed his eyes and turned the prayer beads that only had 107 Bodhi seeds left. No matter how important the matter was, the king of Jing and would always finish chanting before opening his eyes. Even though he knew that his father was meditating like an old monk, Zhao Sun still only dared to glance at his nominal mother out of the corner of his eye. After a complicated glance, he looked away and did not dare to look again. The king of Jing and chanted hundreds and thousands of times. When he opened his eyes, they were already near the palace. He said calmly, "Xianxia, do you know your mistake?" Zhao Sun, who was sitting upright and still, said guiltily, "I know my mistake." Zhao Heng did not pursue the matter. He lifted the curtain and looked out of the carriage. He said indifferently, "I can't see through that child. It's all because of this king's superfluous actions that he made a wrong move." At this point, the king of Jing'an's face darkened. He glanced at the submissive Princess Pei. Seeing that she did not respond like a marionette, he became more and more annoyed. He clenched the prayer beads, took a deep breath, and turned to Zhao Sun. He said, "At the Spring Lake, you wanted to take advantage of the chaos to kill him and shift the blame to the descendants of the Green faction. You had the idea, but you are still not good enough to judge the situation. Who is Su Fengnian? Lame Su is counting on him to carry Bailiang for the rest of his life. Did you really think that a few slaves, Ning Mei, and 100 cavalry would be enough? You are underestimating Zhang Hu. Without that old warrior surnamed Li, Su Fengnian would have died many times over." Zhao Sun lowered his head and said, "Father is right." Zhao Heng frowned, suppressing the irritation in his heart that could not be overcome no matter how much he chanted. He waved his hand to disperse some sandalwood that smelled too much as bad as not enough. Slowly, he said in a low voice, "The capital is very lively. Lame Su is most likely about to fulfill his wish and obtain a hereditary title for his son. However, it is highly likely that he will not be able to keep the title of Pillar of the State. Not only that, Gu Zhentong's journey north to the two Liao provinces was originally because that person in the imperial palace forced Lame Su to declare his position. Bailiang's 300,000 iron cavalry's foundation in the two Liao provinces. Lame Su will have to obediently uproot it himself. Bailiang still appears to be impregnable, and Zhang Baiyan may withdraw when he sees the opportunity. However, the remnants of the fallen state will probably make a move to beat a drowning dog. I just don't know how much of Lame Su's flesh will be bitten off in this dog-eat-dog show. These old dogs, who are number one in the world in fishing for fame and reputation, only have this much prospects and use." When Zhao Sun heard his father's harsh evaluation of the old officials in the hall as a bunch of old dogs, he naturally smiled contemptuously. Only then did he recover the bearing of a vassal king and his royal highness should have. The dynasty originally had 13 provinces. Although they were now living in harmony with the people of 17 provinces of the 8 kingdoms of spring and autumn, how could they not have a natural sense of superiority in their hearts? If the common people were like this, then Zhao Sun and this small group of top-notch royal family members who rightfully regarded the whole world as their own private property. Furthermore, of the 6 vassal kings including Zhao Heng, except for the most useless Duke of Huainan, the rest had all participated in the War of Spring and Autumn. Each of them had their own military exploits. After the war ended, which vassal king's manor did not have a few concubines and princesses of the dead emperor as concubines and servants. Duke of Guangling even had an empress and 2 imperial concubines. Since that was the case, what status did the remaining elders of the 8 kingdoms have in their eyes? Even if you were resourceful and had a splendid military exploits, who would be foolish enough to worship you like a bodhisattva? Sitting at the same table, they all disliked dirtying their eyes. After getting off the carriage and returning to the Fu, the king of Jing'an, who was amiable and approachable with Su Fengnian at the inn, ignored the countless servants who knelt at the sight of him. Passing through the halls and corridors, they approached a Buddhist hall. Zhao Sun silently turned and left. Zhao Hang entered the dark hall where a red sandalwood statue of Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva was enshrined. Princess Pei hesitated and was about to turn when the prayer beads in Zhao Heng's hands, which were already missing a Bodhi seed, suddenly broke. The beads fell onto the white jade floor of the silent hall with an ear-piercing sound. Zhao Hang, who had personally destroyed the string of horse ropes, no longer had any concealment. With a ferocious expression, he stared fixedly at Wang Fei. Gnashing his teeth, he said, "Stop! Shameless thing, if you speak a few more words with that bastard lame Su, will you even lose your soul?" Princess Pei did not refute and allowed the king of Jing'an to humiliate her. At this moment, she was like the statue of the Bodhisattva, without the slightest bit of humanity. Outsiders all said that it was a great fortune for her, the orphan of the Pei family, to be able to marry into the Jing'an palace. Her skin was as white as snow. The rumor on the streets was that the king of Jing'an, who had won the beauty's heart, had an elegant hobby. He hid a 3-foot-tall jade statue and would play with the beauty at night. He was more charming than the jade statue. It was the envy of others. Just hearing about it was enough to make all the debauches in the world drool. The king of Jing'an did not stop there. He walked forward and grabbed Wang Fei's black hair, dragging her into the hall. He viciously threw her to the ground and yelled, "Pei Nanwei, in what way is this king not worthy of a lowly slut like you? In these 10 years, when have you ever treated this king as your husband? Who is this king? Do you know? This king is only 1 step away from the dragon throne. 1 step? Who else in the world is more worthy than this king to wear the dragon robe?" Princess Pei, with her black hair scattered on the ground like a blooming lotus, finally raised her head and calmly asked, "Since I am a slut, how are you worthy?" King of Jing and Zhao Heng's expression froze. There was no more malice in his eyes. He crouched down and reached out to touch Wang Fei's face. He gently said, "Wei did this king hurt you?" Princess Pei turned her head away and softly said, "It doesn't hurt.